Hello and welcome to FPL Have a Beer, where I invite you to have a beer with me while I talk about FPL. Please like if you enjoyed the video and please help subscribe. I was going to say, Roberto, before I looked at YouTube, just before coming on here, to help me get up to 200 subscribers, but I've literally just hit 200 subscribers in the last half an hour. So please subscribe to help start me getting towards 300, I guess. and
Fantastic news.
Thank you,
Yeah,
mate.
brilliant.
And to help me support the channel, to help support the channel. So, welcome to another interview in the FPL Meet the Manager, Meet the Content Creator interview series, where I ask one of our lovely FPL content creators about their experiences of content creation, their thoughts on FPL and mental health, and we have a general chat about FPL and how their season's going towards the end. So, for our 12th interview in the series, I'm delighted to welcome on Roberto, who is probably better known to the FPL community as FPL Yellow Army. Roberto, I'm delighted to have you on the channel, mate. We sort of met last week, didn't we, on Elite FPL's watch along video, but that was a bit manic. I don't know how you found it.
Oh, it was manic with a capital M, wasn't it? It was crazy. You know, the thing about live football, and it's the same with any kind of sport, I suppose, live sport, is there's so much unpredictability. And when you get 7 other kind of content creators on a stream, you know, Elite FPL's videos, why we love them is because they're already chaotic and their technical difficulties and their technical hitches are part of the fun.
Yeah.
And so when you combine that with loads of content creators talking about games live and giving FPL updates, oh, it was chaos, but absolutely wouldn't have it any other way,
I'm,
and really enjoyed it.
I'm a bit sad. I listened to it the following morning on the way to work, and there was one point where we were saying that like Nick Triggerlips was 5 minutes behind, and we were like taking the piss out of him a bit, and I just burst out laughing on a like crowded tube.
Literally, it's that sort of content. Like, this is what Elite FPL does. They produce content that makes you laugh out loud in public, and it's fantastic. So yeah, really enjoyed it.
It's great to have you on, mate. So just looking at my list of questions. So I know you've watched at least a few interviews. So I'll go for my usual list of questions, but as you know, I do like to throw a couple of other ones in there as well. So I was wondering, to start with, if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself. I keep saying where you live. It's not where you live. It's where you grew up. I don't want you to dox yourself or me to dox you or whatever.
It's all good.
Who you support, what are your first memories of football, stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah, pleasure. So to start off with, I was actually born in Welwyn Garden City, in the Welwyn Garden City Hospital.
That's just
And
outside.
then
That's just outside London, isn't it?
it's kind of like it's near sort of the Hertfordshire region.
Yeah.
So kind of like Stevenage and that sort of thing. And so yeah, that was where I was originally born. But in terms of where I actually lived for like my whole life, I've always lived in Hertford. So
Nice.
Hertford is in Hertfordshire itself, and it's local to sort of like the kind of Stevenage, Watford area. And yeah, so I've kind of always been well, I say always. No, I haven't. That's part of the story. In terms of football, being a football fan, it took me quite a while to actually get into football, funnily enough, which is weird because, you know, I think a lot of FPL content creators or FPL managers for that matter, they talk about their love of football coming first and the FPL kind of coming as a byproduct of that. But for me, my love of football, yeah, it took a while because when I was like a toddler, when I was 6, 7, 8, I wasn't really that interested. My dad was someone who was always interested in football, and he kind of started that journey for me. So he went to school in Radlett, which is like near Watford sort of area. And so he's always been a lifelong Watford fan. And I, yeah, was not interested in football. Very early on, I kind of went to a few games, but they were kind of like very much casual viewing of matches. I think I went to the odd Arsenal match and I went to the odd like England match, but I had no affinity to a club. And then my dad just basically convinced me, you know, Watford was the team to support. It was my local team because it was really close to Hertford. So yeah, I started the train of being a Watford fan, the, you know, unenviable roller coaster of emotions that is being a Watford fan.
So what age did you really start getting into it, mate? Like teenager?
I'd probably say I think my first Watford game, like that I went to as a fan was around about 2010, 2011.
You're
And then
21, aren't you? So
yeah, so I was around about 9, something like
yeah.
that. If the maths works out, which it usually doesn't, I'm pretty bad at maths. But yeah, so with that, it was quite slow and steady. But I think around the kind of 2012, 2013 years, that was when I really committed to kind of going to actual Watford games, really being a devoted fan. And that's where, once you start, you can't stop. It just hooks you in. So then, a couple championship seasons followed where we had that amazing Deeney moment in the semi final, and that was incredible. And then didn't go up that season in the playoff final, and then it was a couple of seasons of success in the championship, followed by a promotion in 2015, which was incredible, up to the Premier League. And then that was where my love for football and my love for FPL started to combine because
I
I was
the Premier League.
yeah, because I was watching more Premier League kind of games because Watford were in the Premier League in 2015. My interest in the Premier League was heightened. So naturally, I saw a lot more with my family and my friends, and I heard about them playing fantasy football. And then it kind of took me a while, but after a while in 2018-19 season, that was the season I started playing FPL, mainly because of that kind of family rivalry of seeing my cousins, seeing my uncles and aunts playing it. And I thought, well, I want to get myself involved in this. So it took me a long time, to be honest, which is surprising when I'm so addicted now. Like the contrast of how much I was into it back then and how much I am in now, you'd have thought I was playing the game for 20 odd years. So it's been quite surprising to see. I think I'm a bit of an all in person in general. Like when I come into certain habits or I come into certain interests, I don't really just kind of like dip my toe in. I really commit to it, and it meant that now FPL is. I almost can't imagine a life without FPL now that I'm in it. So it's an incredible kind of change, really.
My only memory of, because I got into FPL, I think 2015, 2016 season as well. I've took two memories. Obviously, Troy Deeney, I occasionally had in my team. But do you remember, I think it was Watford, there was like this midfielder called Kapawe or something. And,
Etienne Capoue.
yeah, and he was like supposed to be really shit. And then he went on like, did he score for like the first 4 or 5 games of the season? At 4
So there
points?
was.
And I finally bought him in, and then he stopped and didn't score again for the whole rest.
Etienne Capoue was a funny one because he was someone, who he didn't really do the business at Tottenham. Like he was very much out of favour, didn't get games, and didn't really score many goals. And then he joined us in 2016, and that season we'd just come off the back of a really good season with our kind of first season back up. We'd finally got safety, which was a pretty rare thing for us because previously with like the likes of Adi Boothroyd and other managers, we'd just gone back down at the first attempt. So it was really refreshing to see us, actually cement ourselves in the league. And yeah, we signed Capoue, and he was just a sensation in that first season. Scored something like 4-5 games in a row in the first 2 games of the season. And yeah, he was one of those players
It was 4.5, wasn't he, as well, I think.
He was really cheap. Yeah, he was. He was never someone you'd bring in at the start of the season, but he was one of those bandwagon players. As soon as he started, his purple patch continued, and yeah, from that point onwards, I mean, Watford, in terms of FPL and Watford, I mean, because I didn't start till 18-19, I kind of, that was the stage where I was casual with my kind of FPL involvement in Watford players. So because I was taking hits every week, I had like players like Isaac Success, who, if any other Watford fans know who that is, his name is ironic because he was the complete opposite of that at the club.
I remember him. Yeah, I remember him. I always laughed every time I saw his.
He literally scored. He scored about 3 goals in the Premier League. It was dreadful. But it's funny because now I look at how I play the game now and I take it much more seriously. I'm much more engaged. If Watford were in the Premier League right now, there is absolutely zero chance I'd have a Watford player in my FPL team. But back then, in that 18-19, sort of 19-20 season, I'd be taking hits to bring in Gerard Deulofeu. I'd be taking hits to bring in, centre-backs like, Proddle from Watford, or the fullback legend Darry Amat, players like that you'd never bring them in previously, but now there's this kind of more logical stance that I take towards it, where I'm like, well, yeah, I do like to kind of go with my kind of my own biases, but ultimately we're trying to get points and we're trying to beat everyone else. So that's where I've changed sort of my management style, I guess.
And you're at university, is that right, mate? What are you studying? What are you enjoying? Are you
Wow,
enjoying it? Sorry.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that, because that's part of the kind of journey which I'll go on to talk on about with my podcast, because it's quite a weird thing how it's all come about. Because in first year at university, obviously a lot of people are the same, where they join a course, they're a bit scared of like what's going to come, they don't quite know. So it is very much like a treading water that first year of university, where you're trying to get to know friends, you're trying to be bold in your course, and it's almost like you're doing the bare minimum in your course, and you're just trying to get submissions and deadlines done, and you're just like, let's just get through this first year.
That's what all
and
my students do, I'm sure.
Literally. And then it's only by second year, I think, that you've built up enough confidence to then go outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that applies to both assignments that you're doing and as a sports journalist with my course.
And that's the degree you're doing, yeah?
Yeah. So sports journalism, which I was always kind of confident I'd do at university, because I've got a passion for football and a passion for writing. I thought, let's try and merge these two things together and get the best of both worlds, really. And in first year, I think I was frustrated by, particularly the lack of kind of sport in my course. But this is the thing, is that
a lack of
to be a great
sport
journalist,
in a sports journalism, that's a bit weird, isn't it?
I know, but it's understandable. Now I look back and look from a bigger picture. I'm glad it happened the way it happened, because to be a good sports journalist, you have to be a good journalist first. And that means covering news stories that you'd find maybe a bit mundane, a bit uninteresting as a sports journalist. But you have to get that solid foundation and basing of knowing what works with the law, what works with the ethical side of things of journalism, how best to approach contacts for interviews, like all these basic skills. You build it up in first year, and then in second year, you can kind of get more involved and it gets a bit more advanced. And so in second year, I had built up that confidence. I'd kind of got more, tech savvy, because a lot of journalism, especially at the University of Lincoln, which I'm really enjoying the course, is about not just being a journalist, but being a journalist in the modern era. And that involves being able to create podcasts, being able to shoot video, kind of photography, that sort of thing. There's so much more to it. You have to kind of be a journalist in the modern world with technology, with social media. It's kind of not just you're in front of a camera and someone does all the camera work for you and you have to just basically ask questions. It's much more kind of advanced than that. So because of that confidence I built up, I thought, well, I'm really engaged as an FPL manager, and we're in these lecture rooms and there's studios that we're doing these podcasts and we're editing.
And that's where you are now, isn't it, mate?
And that's where I am right now. Yeah, soundproof little studio. And I thought to myself, I love FPL. Will I ever make an FPL podcast? Well, when I'm older, when I'm an adult, I probably won't have the time as much as I'd love to. And who knows if I'll be, what I want to go on and do is be a football commentator. So who knows if I'll be doing that, at some point. And so will I actually have time to produce an FPL podcast that is fun and is something I can do in my free time? Well, I thought to myself, maybe this is the year I do it. So I made a really good friend in first year.
Let me stop you a minute, Roberto, because I'm going to get on to your podcast. There's a few questions I want to ask you.
I'm waffling.
It's all right. No, that's all right. That's all right. One thing I was going to say, though, was I know that quite a few podcasts that have been going for quite a long time, like Tom from Who Got the Assist told me he started his when he was at uni, and I've heard a few others, so I think it's a good place to start up. Do you think it's a good place to start a podcast? Just the time you've got, or?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I thought to myself, probably in first year, when I was so kind of overwhelmed in a way by the level of work, when you can compare that to school and sixth form and that sort of thing, it's a big jump up. But I also, once I had that first year, then knew how to manage the workload. a lot more. So it became more of a, I'm going to do this as a kind of stress reliever. And second year and third year, I knew it was going to be intense. So to have that kind of slot in the week to talk about FPL, and very early on, it was more a kind of, we're talking amongst ourselves. We're not necessarily getting guests on. We're just chatting about the game we love, and we're putting it out on Spotify, and that's how it started, really. So my best mate from first year, who kind of quickly made great friends with, Chris. He, as the kind of co-host of the podcast, he's a Chelsea fan, and he basically said, we both love FPL. We're both addicts at this game. And so then I mentioned in second year, should we just start an FPL podcast? And it was literally as simple as that. We just kind of got into Spotify, made a podcast, and just started filming on Wednesday nights regularly. And the fact is, if we hadn't have taken that plunge, like, I don't honestly know, like, when I would ever have done an FPL podcast.
That's great.
So
I'm going to come on. I've got a whole set of questions on your podcast, but I want to ask you a little bit about before the podcast first, if that makes sense. But before we do that, I did want to mention one thing. Was we were talking about university. As you know, I'm a lecturer at university, and I put as one of my topics for students could do their dissertation on fantasy football and mental health, because I've done some research on that. I didn't expect anyone to sign up to it because I thought this is such a niche thing. But one guy actually has done. He's a really big football FPL fan. He's been playing for about 10 years. He watches all the content, and he's actually liked and subscribed to my channel. So I said I would give Angus a shout out if he's watching. He probably isn't, but just in case he is. So I think we've jumped through a lot of the questions I had here. So I'm right in saying your FPL content creator journey started before the podcast. That's correct, isn't it?
It did, yeah. So I was going to mention.
Could you maybe talk us through like how you first started prior to the podcast, and then maybe talk me up to sort of like through the FPL juice stuff up until you started the podcast, and then we'll talk about that next. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. Yeah. So kind of going back to what I was saying about when I started playing FPL in 18-19, that season, I honestly don't remember that season. Like, it was such a bad season for me that first year, where I was taking hits. I think my rank was about 3 million. Like, it was shocking. But I've got like no evidence, no visual proof or screenshots or anything like that of what my team would look like that season. But I clearly played that season, so I was, as I said, very much a casual.
It's in your rank history, isn't it?
Yeah,
unfortunately.
It's sat there in my rank history, and we'll get on to talk about that, because there's a kind of weird thing on the FPL site where the 1920 season was obviously, with COVID, a very unique season. That year, I got very bored in lockdown and basically created a second team just from game week 30 onwards, kind of over lockdown, just for a bit of fun. And what I was doing was, I had my dad's email basically that I was using for my main FPL team that season. But for some reason, I don't know why, I managed to have this kind of not fake, but this kind of fun team that didn't mean anything, that was starting in lockdown. It was on this account rather than my dad's email.
So this is when it closed down for 3 months and then started back up again in June, wasn't
literally it? Just to get me back in the interest of FPL. I just thought, wow, this season's in the bin a little bit. Let's just do something fun and see how a team does from kind of lockdown onwards. And so what happens is, this rank that I get from that lockdown team is reflected in my game week history, my season history on my actual account, when actually my finished rank that season was something like 1.1 million or something. But on the FPL site, it's showing up as 7 million, which obviously.
So have you gone on to continue to use your dad's account then?
No. So this is the thing that I'm a bit confused about, because I think I swapped around the accounts where I made sure this is my own account now that I'm currently using. But because I think my dad doesn't use that email anymore, that's why you can't see that finish I had originally. So basically, weird. I think that season I seem to use my dad's account, or his email, not his own FPL team, but his email address. And now he doesn't use that. It's in the abyss. But I finished about at 1 million. But that season was the season where it was a bit of a turning point for me, because that season in 1920, the start of that season, I have a huge friend as well from school who's also a Watford fan.
Mm.
And I played that first season, 18-19, really enjoyed it. And I got my mate to basically join me as a fellow Watford fan. I said to him, you know what, you love football, don't you? And he was like, yeah. And he said, like, play FPL, give it a go. And from that point onwards, my mate Adam, like a rivalry was born, a bit like Elite FPL talk about how their kind of show,
Yeah,
obviously through
like Steve and
um,
Jason rivalry.
yeah, their rivalry is born this kind of competitive nature to the game, and obviously that they've started through Torbay Elite and their own mini league and stuff. But for me and Adam, it was about beating each other every season. So that kind of drove up my engagement levels with the game, just trying to beat him. He beat me that season, and as I said, it was difficult with COVID, so I had a bad finish in the end of about 1 million. But then FPL Juice comes in. Now, FPL Juice was the turning point for me in terms of reflecting on my ranks.
Sorry.
Because,
So FBL Juice, you're still not starting creating content here. They just start their channel.
no. So that's the thing.
Right.
Like 18-19, as I said, literally no posting of my team. 19-20, I think I was just putting like my team out on Instagram, and that was literally it.
Mm.
But then I discovered Juice in the summer of 2020. Obviously, that was around lockdown as well. So it all kind of coincided. And that season started a bit later, I believe, in sort of September time. That's when Juice first started putting out videos. And I'm not joking, it was about 3 or 4 episodes into Juice, starting up. And as soon as I found their first videos, it was like a light bulb moment where
So
suddenly
this is the first FPL content you consumed then, or
literally
wow,
it was.
okay.
Like I'd heard other podcasts, like kind of very briefly, like the official FPL pod or FPL Family, for instance. I'd heard a few of theirs, but I wasn't like engaged with it every single game week. Whereas as soon as I heard Juice, who had successfully managed to produce content for FPL and have a massive slice of it in terms of an entertainment value,
Yeah.
that they brought other stuff to the kind of to the table. And because of their launch pod studios, their studio setup, it was a completely different watch for me. Like, whereas with other podcasts, you don't really get a sense of, the production.
They're the first in. I mean, there's a couple now that Raptor does his, but they were the first, weren't they?
Yeah,
From
they were the trailblazers for using the studio. Yeah, absolutely. And so because of that, and that's part of why I love Juice, was because of how engaging they were and how interactive they were. So that season, I would be commenting, on every live stream and that sort of thing. They'd throw up comments, and it'd be that sort of engagement that it makes you feel included. It makes you feel as part of a community. And so
I'll tell you something, Roberto. I'm going on there next week. I'm sort of I think this will probably come out after or just about the same time. I'm sort of bricking it. I'm thinking, like, what am I going to say for my room 101? Things like that.
Hey, this is why Juice is brilliant, because they just come up with categories and little like segments of the show that no other show provides, and that's its USP. Like it brings stuff that FPL managers don't always talk about, and so you want to see that different side to the guests that come on Juice and the pundits that talk about their teams.
Yeah, I've heard sorry mate, Steve-O said to me like Praz was on there, and I always see Praz as like being quite I wouldn't say, I mean, you see a bit of fun on him, but he's not very serious because he's, explaining all his stuff. And he said when he was on there, he was just absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, it was brilliant. And that's the thing. It's like what Juice do is they take the kind of so-called experts. It's a tag that people throw around and say, oh, these are the people that go on official FPL's podcasts and their official FPL show, and they're producing this kind of almost this professional portfolio of their own FPL histories, right? And they're saying, this is how I finished this season. This is the advice I'll give, and you can take it or leave it.
It's a bit like a CV, I guess, really, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. But what Juice do is they get to show us that side, for instance, to Praz, who's another great member of the community that we don't always see on, for instance, the FPL Wire, right? So it's so valuable to get that fun side of people, that we're all FPL managers and we all like to have fun with the game. And that's why I valued Juice's content so much in those early stages. And then the audience sort of participation that I was talking about with Juice, they then extended it up another notch around sort of like, I think it was April time in 2021. And that was the sort of verge of when the Super League kind of chaos started, right? And that's its kind of see. There was a pod that the Juice Boys did, and it was literally like it was like a phone call, sort of like getting guests on talking about the Super League. And that episode. I jumped on and started talking, and literally from that point on, my participation in Juice just shot up in terms of.
So they had like live call-in sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. And actually, I think Ross Raptor was one of the guys that joined that night. It was him. I think it was Ray Qureshi. I think it was also trying to remember who the others were now. There was quite a lot of guests that went on that one show. And from that point, Juice were like, we've got something here. Like, we've got something that a lot of other pods don't do, where they'll just have a script, they'll stick to it, and they'll, have back and back chat between two kind of co-hosts.
You couldn't really talk about that sort of thing in a normal FPL podcast. I mean, you might mention it, but you're not going to spend a long time talking about it because it doesn't fit in with the format, does it?
Exactly. So yeah, really enjoyed like helping out with some of their discussions. Really, it was more of a interaction sort of thing. And then at the end of that season, Juice said, okay, ahead of the 21-22 season, we're going to do this thing where you're going to have like pundits, basically. You're going to have club experts for each of the Premier League clubs. And that season in 20-21, Watford got promoted again. So Watford were going up for 21-22. And I basically, there's not many Watford fans in the FPL community. So I submitted my application to kind of be the Watford correspondent for FPL Juice, and they accepted it. And we had a couple of like first few the game weeks of the season where we produced videos for the upcoming week and saying which Watford players would you bring in, that sort of thing. And they called them the Juicers, which was basically a shortened for like journalistically untrained club expert reporter. And it was really good fun. But
you won't be able to go back because you'll be trained.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, it was back then it was a good kind of little fun gag to get in on. But unfortunately, that didn't really take off because basically the other juicers of the other teams, they just weren't sending in the videos regularly enough. So it was something that couldn't be sustained. But from that point on, I'd kind of got a part of me in Juice where I'd produce content for them, and I felt part of the family even more than previously. So from that point on, yeah, I really, because of my Juice involvement, got engaged with the Twitter side of things, and that's when I made my Twitter account really that season.
And you did have before your podcast, you do have like a YouTube channel, don't you? But you have like 150 subscribers. You made a few videos, and you said you've kind of had a few channels, it sounds like, before you started the podcast.
Yeah, so there is a bit of story with that. Obviously, in this first, like 1920 season, I had this YouTube channel called Roberto Hollis. It was literally as simple as that, and it was my Google account, and I was putting the odd FPL video up on that season. And then when I left my school, funnily enough, that email was basically deleted because when we left, it was no longer a thing. So
you used your school email.
Yeah, I did. I know. It sounds basic, but that was where I was at that stage. I didn't.
Yeah.
Really,
you were a kid.
I was very young, yeah, for a content creator at least. But and so yeah, then I made a new channel called Roberto the Hornet, which was kind of majority of it was actually like football content. So it was predictions for the Premier League, Watford vlogs. So when I was going to Watford games, I'd do kind of vlogs of matches.
Nice.
And it was again very like casual. But then I'd produce the odd FPL video on that channel. And then that 21-22 season, when I was, producing content for Juice, I then started moving that content on my own, like, dedicated YouTube channel called FPL Yellow Army. And I'd already actually had my FPL Yellow Army account because I was commenting on every Juice kind of video. But then that's where the videos were born, really. So, and I really enjoyed that because a lot of people say, when it comes to YouTube especially, that their content is to give something to the community that we don't often see, or get engagement and get people watching and listening. For me at that time, and it's, to be honest, to this day stays the same, where I produce FPL YouTube videos, number one, when I have the time, which when I was, sort of around that time, 21, 22, that was kind of A-level time. I was quite busy. And then obviously the first year of uni in 2022, it was a thing of, if I have time, I'll do it. If I really want to do it, I'll do it. It was an enjoyment thing for me more.
Roberto, is it a much, because I've never done a podcast, I mean, I guess you could think of this could be made a podcast, but is it much easier to do a podcast than YouTube videos. I guess if you're making vlogs, that's a lot more work than just like sit. I mean, I'm just sitting here talking to you. And sorry, like, go ahead, answer. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Now you're absolutely right. That was the thing. It was like at the end of my time at school, I had more time to produce videos on YouTube. Whereas when it got to sort of like start of uni time, that's when my time just fell away. And that's when obviously that first year of uni, I didn't do the podcast because I was literally just had up in my eyes with work. But that was the thing, if like that transition from YouTube to not much YouTube to then a podcast in 2023 was very much a time kind of reliant thing. But even the time when I had the time, I'd only post YouTube videos for my own benefit, not for necessarily the benefit of my listeners, which sounds weird, and my viewers, because I like kind of voicing out my thoughts ahead of a coming game week. And so it wasn't for me about necessarily getting people to interact and helping to answer people's questions. It was more, this is what I'm doing with my team. This is how I'm justifying my transfers. You know, take that with a pinch of salt, or, you know, use with that information what you will. And so that was why what's fueled my enjoyment of YouTube. And then the same thing transferred across when I started the Form is Temporary podcast, where I wasn't producing it very early on. Me and Chris weren't producing it because necessarily we had a community to please. Like, we were very early on. We started off with very few followers. But at that stage, we just enjoyed the process of making the pods. So it was, for me, a much more of a kind of a selfish thing. It doesn't sound necessarily selfish, but it's almost like it was more of a self-indulgent thing, me producing content, than a sort of like, let's do it because this is the community that we want. And I guess when the podcast got bigger and the Form is Temporary got more of a following, that's when the community started to build. And then you've got kind of gains to be had from a kind of my perspective, but also I enjoy the engagement now there is with it.
Okay, so let's get on to talk about a bit about the podcast. So, as I said, one of the things I wanted to talk about with you here is the podcast. So it's called The Form is Temporary. You've talked a little bit about. I was going to ask you about the background, but I think you've kind of covered that already. So I've listened to 2 episodes, I think, and I really, really like it. So I highly recommend subscribing. You can't subscribe, can you? I highly recommend listening. But
you can follow on Spotify.
Yeah, highly recommend following. But we've been exchanging messages for quite a while now, and one of the things I kind of wanted to get into is how difficult is it to get a successful podcast, and I'm going to define that as decent amount of views in 2023 into a crowded market. So the first thing I say to you is, I mean, I know what your numbers are, perhaps not as high. I'm not going to say the numbers. You can if you want. Why do you think you're perhaps not quite getting the traction? Do you mind if I say?
Yeah, it's all right. It's all good.
You're getting about 40, 50 listens per episode, yeah?
Yeah.
Which is decent, but I'm sure you'd like it to be higher. Why do you think you're not getting more viewers?
This is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about time, is because of what fuels our motivation to do the podcasts. It's actually, funny enough, not the analytics side of things, where we look at, for instance, the Spotify for Podcasters app, and we look at how many listens per episode. It's more, to be honest, the individual people that kind of give feedback about the podcast. So if, for instance, we'll have filmed a podcast, you know, for instance, last season we had a few with some really great guests, like the likes of Alistair Bruce Ball, BBC commentator. You know, we had Sam from FPL Family, and sometimes it's more about the people that have commented, like message me on Instagram or Twitter, whatever it will be, saying, you know what, I really enjoyed that podcast that you did the other week. And that's the sort of thing that keeps our motivation.
Yeah.
So it's more a thing of like the personal interactions for me with the podcast, much more than the overall scale of how many listeners are you getting each week. And that's, obviously it's great. As you said, you know, it'd be great if we had more, but I think Juice said this, you know, a few seasons ago, and they keep saying it, which I agree with, is as much as like Juice, obviously they did brilliantly to get nominated for the FCAs, and it's great that they're getting the recognition that they deserve because they've been smashing it for so many years now, since 2020. But almost like part of the appeal of smaller podcasts, I think, are that they're not necessarily part of the mainstream. and those fans that follow those podcasts can tap into those niche kind of areas of the community that maybe are a little bit undervalued or maybe a little bit underfollowed, but and the fans that do follow them are those hardcore fans. So you can almost like, if you get a big podcast, how many of those listeners will listen absolutely every week? Or will it just be they're subscribed to them and then they don't end up watching them every week? Whereas you get a small group and then
I'm going to push you a bit. I'm going to try and be a bit of a journalist myself, because you kind of gave me a good answer, but you gave me a bit of a politician's answer. So the question was, why do you think you've not got more listeners? I can tell that obviously you don't define it as the most important thing, but still why? Because I have my own theory, but which I can share as well. But I think it's probably just because the marketplace is so overcrowded. But I'll let you share your thoughts.
You're definitely right with that. There's two things to me with the reason why we haven't been as followed as we have. Number one, the energy we put into it is a part of it. And as uni students, a lot of that energy is naturally sapped out of us in the week through the course that we do. And number two, I think part of the problem is to kind of get your foot in the door as an FPL podcast. You need a big following from the start of this, when you make the podcast. And obviously, like, I will be forever thankful for Juice, because they basically elevated me into the FPL community. It's as simple as that. Getting involved in their pod, commenting every week, and then doing the videos for them, as Juicer and having a few appearances on that show. They helped me basically build my Twitter following, right? So, I got 2.4k followers. And that a lot of that is down to Juice. And so that's why I'm forever grateful to them. And so when you have that kind of reason for a certain number of followers, it won't necessarily translate when you then make a podcast, because the people that you have listening to the pod might be from all over the world and they've never heard of you through Juice. So there's almost like that sort of like, it's not easy to necessarily transfer across the reasons as to why you're followed on one social media platform and then onto another with Spotify. So I think it's important to distinguish. You're almost starting from scratch when you start a podcast, whereas you get some people now, and podcasts have become so saturated now, where you got already established YouTubers like your likes of FPL Mate Dan, who does really good stuff, obviously with Sim FPL as well, with their Stick to FPL. They've already started something there because they're already content creators, and that's why
or FPL Raptor.
Exactly, FPL Therapy, yeah. That's why their podcast is so engaged with as it is, because they've already made a name for themselves. Whereas my podcast was almost an attempt to make a name for myself. And so naturally, I think the kind of differences in following is there. But like I was saying earlier, me and Chris, we're not bothered by that. And I think we're kind of, it seems silly because it statistically we want to do well, but we almost pride ourselves more in the enjoyment of what we do and almost staying humble. It sounds really like weird to say that, but like some people, they'll complain and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not getting engagement on my Twitter account, or I'm not getting reposts on my podcast." But for us, it's more about the quality of interactions rather than the quantity. So
can I go into a bit of a rant, Roberto? Because I do listen to podcasts, but I really listen to them on YouTube. I don't listen to Spotify, but I kind of see the same thing in. I made the second part to my tier list yesterday. It will be coming out sometime in 2025. And I was reviewing a couple of I called them daily content creators, like Let's Talk FPL, FPL Raptor. But now we've got some newer ones like Dylan and Fran. But I've also had a couple of guys on here like FPL Tom, Golden Goal Fantasy Football. They would probably be absolutely massive. They've got about 10,000 subscribers, but they would probably be 150,000 subscribers, but they're going into such a saturated market that it's very difficult. And with the podcast, as you say, you've got people who can move from YouTube to there, and the podcast is even more because people can listen to multiple short form videos if they really want to, but most people haven't got time to listen to 2 or 3 podcasts a week. So you really are moving into a crowded market, aren't you? So the next thing I was going to ask you, mate, is you've had some amazing guests on the show. I didn't know you had some of those. I had written down here as Holly Strand, Ash from FPL Juice. I know you got the Elite FPL lads on tonight. I'd first like to say thank you to some of those people and to yourself, Roberto, and all the great people who've come on my channel. That must have been amazing. So what was those experiences like for you? And do you think that's helped increase the numbers at all?
I mean, that's the funny thing about how our podcast has progressed, because when we started out, we didn't actually have guests in the opening kind of first few episodes. So our first podcast, it was me and Chris, and we were literally just talking about our teams for that week. And it's a bit like with Juice in a way. You know, you look at where podcasts start off, and they start basic. They start in terms of the pure raw, what do people want to listen to? And it's FPL discussions between two people.
Sorry, Roberto, they don't release theirs as a podcast, do they? It might be a stupid question.
Well, Juice started off where they'd regularly upload on Spotify, and then it got to a stage where they were just not as bothered by it. So it was a bit, in and out sometimes. But sometimes they do put it on Spotify, yeah. But what I was going to say was, the very early days. So we had me and Chris on the first two episodes. I think the first one was a game week preview. The next one, we actually did a non-FPL video podcast, and it was talking about VAR at the time, because it was in the kind of aftermath of that Luis Diaz goal that was
I remember that
against Tottenham, and that was a kind of our theme of the pod. And it's funny actually. At the start, we thought we were going to do an FPL and football podcast, and it just got to a stage where we just did FPL mostly.
I think you can only. I thought about doing that on this one stage on this channel, and I uploaded the video's not there anymore. I uploaded a Premier League tier list. I was basically going to tier list every single Premier League season, and I live previewed it, and I had about 5 dislikes within 10 minutes. So I just thought, okay, that's not for this channel. I took it down.
This is part of the thing, isn't it? It's like, let's do the content that people enjoy, and ultimately, I'd be lying if I said that 99% of the content I enjoy is FPL, because it is, and so that's why we just moved towards that. But we had a couple of episodes. I think we did one EFL related one. We did actually a couple at the end of last season where we looked at kind of the run in of the Premier League and that sort of thing. But the first few episodes were myself, Chris, and one of my mates from uni as well, who was in my five-a-side team, funnily enough. He's actually doing a video production course for uni called Jack, and he was basically just helped out. I think it was about 3 or 4 episodes in. He came in and was like, I'm happy to help out, I'll be your producer, sort of thing. So he came on, did the sort of like producer role, and he'd make his. I'm
a bit of an idiot when it comes to what does a producer do?
Well, this is the thing. It's more of a title than anything else, but he'd often in the early stages help put the podcast on Spotify. So it's producing in that way, and also he basically gave us ideas.
So he uploads something to the internet. Or is that a bit harsh? On Spotify. Yeah, is that really complicated then?
Well, at the time to us it was back then, because we were like babies at the game.
I'm not meaning to insult your man there. What was his name?
No, it's all good. No, Jack won't mind. But
Jack, sorry if you listen to this.
It's all good. No, it's funny because I like to think that what I do now for the pod, which is basically everything in terms of posting stuff on social media, it's all thanks to Jack, because he introduced to us quick ways of uploading the pod to Spotify and ways to increase engagement. And one of the things that we did through Jack was he came up with the idea of doing like sort of 2-minute clips for the pod, where we got a video version of the podcast we do. And that's where we started doing it like on stuff like this, like StreamYard, like video sort of website channels, because that helps to kind of drive engagement. And also it's exciting to see our guests, on in the flesh sort of thing on video. So we started doing that because of Jack's suggestion. And yeah, Jack was great. He graduated at uni at the end of last season. So he left us ahead of this season. But I feel like, without him, a lot of the kind of technical things that I do now of knowing how to upload it on Spotify, doing all the editing, that sort of thing, I now seem to have that taken on that mantle of that technical guy.
Great,
so it's really good fun.
So what was it like having these great guests on then? And did it help?
I was just going to get to that. So because of Jack doing his help with that, we had basically me and Chris on the pod. And what we do is that's 3 people, right? So we'd say, okay, we'll try and do the pod between the 3 of us. And about a few episodes in, we started thinking, let's get some guests on. And we started off, I think the first guest we had on was one of my mates from uni. And so that was fun because we had 4 of us in the studio. It was the first time we'd done that before. And we just thought, yeah, we really enjoy this. So we tried to do it regularly. And then it got to a stage where we thought, because of how great the community is, and I built up all these great people, these contacts through Juice, the likes of both the FPL Mo, the likes of Ash, Nick, all these people. There's so many that I followed on Twitter. And even the bigger content creators, I've got these connections through going to the likes of Fancy Football Fest, going to, Juice meetups and that sort of thing. So I'd got that contact. And I thought, well, let's start branching out and see if we can get some great guests on. And the likes of Trophy Mo, we had Man on Pods and Darren, who we got on as well. Like, we got some great guests on early on. And so then we started thinking, well, some of the podcasts we'll get my mates from uni on, just to get kind of a shine a light on people that obviously they're not out there in the spotlight and see their thoughts on FPL. But then it's also nice to have that balance of getting on known content creators and seeing how they get on. And it just got to a stage where the guests we were getting on, some of the content creators were so good and it increased engagement when those guests came on, that we started thinking, right, let's just dip into the community now, and let's keep on this trend. And that's where we were very fortunate enough to get some great guests on last season. We had the likes of Adam from Above Average FPL. We had also very, very pleased that we had the likes of Planet FPL James, like some really good guests. And we did a post about the guests that came on at the end of last season, just thanking everyone that come on. We had, I think, Fran for the final episode of the season. So those sort of like guests that really excited us is what set the precedent for the podcast. And nowadays, that's how we try and do things.
It's a high standard.
Exactly, yeah. It's almost like you have to start off and adjust things to kind of work out where to go in the future and really set a precedent. And yeah, we really enjoyed that early stage of where the podcast was kind of unformed and undeveloped, but because of learning through what we enjoyed and what the feedback was, we started to change it.
Can I put you on the spot a bit? Who was your favourite guest so far?
Oh, it's tough, because I tell you what, the episode we did last week with Az, I genuinely believe that's my favourite one we've done this season.
I listened to that because it was great.
Honestly, it was so funny because Az is such a top guy, like really, really funny. And we talked a lot about that, with Yelena and the content she does on her channel. And it was such interesting insights about, the kind of dynamic between himself and Mark, obviously from Black Box. So I think to me, it's always getting inside the mind of our guests. And when we do that, the podcasts are so fun. And we have in the podcast, like our quiz at the end of every episode. And that's something that, thanks to Jack, Jack basically came up with the idea of let's do something fun at the end of each podcast. And the quiz was what we started with. And that always is so fun because you don't see a lot of FPL content creators get involved in stuff like that, like necessarily football stuff, or it could be FPL questions. But you just get a fun way to kind of interact with your guests, and that is what we're here for. So,
can I tell you about a bit of a history lesson for you?
Okay.
There was a time when David Monday, Fantasy Football Scout, he took over. I think when Mark Southern stopped, he was the first sort of fill-in, or the first host, or at least Joe. And he tried to kind of revolutionise the podcast a bit, and he tried to introduce quizzes and stuff. And the fans hated it. I just remember the comments section, this is probably 6 or 7 years ago, were just like, who is this guy? Get him off. And it lasted about 3 weeks, and then they just put it completely back.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's great. And yeah, the FPL community is great. I mean, you've got all these contacts. I'm going to call myself a disruptor in the fantasy football content YouTube. But I've got Az is going to come on in the new year. I think Praz is going to interview him next week. I mean, I know one. They're amazing, aren't they? They're amazing.
They're so good. And for me, it's all about meeting people in the flesh, because obviously everyone talks about how sometimes...
Do they actually come into your studio then?
No, so that's the thing. Because of the fact we were always in Lincoln when we were doing the pods, because we used the podcast recording equipment, if that makes sense.
Which you said is a bit in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln is a bit in the middle of nowhere. It's nice, and obviously it's quite good travel, easy to get to, like trains and that sort of stuff via Stevenage, and that's part of the reason I picked uni, because I don't drive, so it's just very, very convenient. But when it comes to getting guests in, we know that we're not big time. We're not the likes of Raptor and Juice and stuff. We don't hire out massive studios where people can travel down to. We're just literally doing it in our like uni lecture buildings. So what we tend to do is it makes it easier for convenience. But it's funny when I think back to how we used to do the episodes. We'd sometimes what we'd do is we'd record it on the laptop and then literally play the sound of the laptop. This is how amateur we were. The sound of the laptop out of the laptop onto then the microphones that we had to record. So the sound quality was honestly so
young
bad.
people are supposed to be good at technology.
I know. Well, I'm an exception to that rule, Gary. Honestly, put me in front of technology and expect a meltdown. I'm honestly awful. But no, it's so funny how then we started to think, okay, we listened back to it, could have been better. So then we started to gradually get better at that sort of thing. And now the quality we use, because we take it now from StreamYard, so it's so much better. So I think it's important that we, going back to what was your original question, just so I can stay on topic.
We were talking about content creators. Did you enjoy it, and did it help increase the views?
Oh, okay. No, that we've seemed to have gone further back there. That's fine.
Have we?
I think we moved on from that point, but then we went.
Okay.
No, I remember what it was now. It was about the point about we were saying about guests and then saying, oh, is that a thing where I think this side is getting to my head.
I think I asked the question that wasn't on the list. If it's not on my list of questions, then I get lost.
That'll be it. But I think I answered it. Hopefully.
Yeah. No, definitely, mate. You're answering well. Okay, I think you've answered that one. So the last question I was going to ask you about the podcast is: are you going to continue regardless of viewer numbers? One of the reasons I press people on viewer numbers, Roberto, I'm really not that bothered about viewer numbers. You know, I've got a full-time job. I'm just doing this channel for fun. But my question is, will you continue making the podcast regardless of viewer numbers? I think you've kind of indicated you would do that because you don't care too much about viewer numbers, but will you continue it from a time perspective?
So this is the thing. We obviously did it in second year because we had more time, and we knew that ahead of third year we'd have less time. But we carried on the podcast for the second season in this third year of uni because it's, again, going back to what I said about how it's a stress reliever. It's so important when we're in a kind of week of work and our head is full of uni course stuff. Just to have that release is so nice. It's more a mental health thing, which we'll go on to talk about. But that for me, from my perspective, I don't know if Chris is the same. I think he has said that in the past, that it's just such a nice weight off your worries. You can just forget your kind of concerns for an hour and a bit and just chat FPL and have fun with it. So yeah, I think we want to continue it as much as we can this season. We know obviously the amount of episodes we did last season won't be the same this season just because it's third year of uni. So we've got our dissertations to write and we've got things to hand in around sort of like we got exams in sort of May, April time, more exams in January. So actually we'll kind of mention that on the podcast, how we'll probably be missing out maybe sort of like a couple game weeks in January, maybe a sort of 4 or 5 game weeks in sort of like April, May time, because that's when it will really feel real. But what I've really enjoyed is doing the podcast around my studies, because it's actually allowed me to take that time off when around the podcast that I put out the content, it's so intense. So you just need that let off. What I will say is about that, sometimes it does get in the way of my work. But the problem with me is I'm so, like, as I was saying earlier, I'm so all in on one thing where if I'm starting to produce a certain number of posts about the podcast, I like a routine. Like I'm a guy, I'm a sucker for a routine. So for instance, if I post about the pod coming out on a Thursday morning, which we often do, my routine in my head that I've now got stuck to is I'll put out a couple of clips from the pod on that Thursday and maybe one on the Friday. And then the next week I'll do the exact same thing and I'll post out the mini league for the podcast and that sort of thing on a Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever the game week ends. And if I don't do those things, for me, it's weird because that's what I'm so used to. And sometimes that'll come at the cost of me doing work, which is terrible. But I'm just a creature of habit. So for me, it's a bit of an escapism for me. And that's why I want to carry on the podcast as much as possible but we obviously have to factor in the course as well that we're doing. And so that's why content will be a bit fewer weeks than last season, probably.
I'll say two things, Roberto. First of all, I'm exactly the same. I mean, I do my day job, obviously, but I'm supposed to have been applying for senior lecturer, which is a big, long application, which is something I'm only going to have time to do in the evenings, and I've been putting it off for weeks because I love doing these and appearing on Elite FPL. But the second thing is, I imagine, sometimes people who've not been students, or maybe have forgotten forget how much work being a student is. I actually think it'd probably be more easy to do a podcast when you've got a job and you've got the evenings free than when you're a student. If you get what I mean.
I do.
Okay, so I'm going to go on to ask you some of the normal questions I sort of ask in the interview, in these interviews. So what would you say are the positive and the negatives of being a content creator? And I thought I'd prompt you here because one of the things you wanted to talk about was the impact of community events on your personal sense of belonging. So maybe you could talk about that a bit here, as well as the general positive and negatives.
Yeah. So to go to your first point about the impact of being a content creator, for me, I mean, obviously everyone deals with it differently. Because of the fact we're kind of minnow content creators, we even call us content creators. I don't know. That's it goes back to sort of expert thing. But we produce content.
There's content.
Yeah, there's content we put out. There's content we put out, and that's the thing. It's like you have certain FPL experts that are sometimes branded, where they'll go on shows and they'll be told that if official FPL tweets about them, then they seem to know it all. But to me, that's not what being a content creator is all about.
Can I just plug something which has nothing to do with this channel? There's a thing that I listened to a couple months ago. It was on Planet FPL. They do that vote thing. Vote, and they did a whole podcast about what is an FPL expert, and it's great. It's great. Sorry, mate. Sorry, I just thought that's really interesting to listen to if viewers have time.
Definitely. Great plug. No, so what for me, I like to. I think I should. Well, not I, but I think we as a collective FPL kind of community should redefine the content creator, because for me, I think people associate content creators with the people that get the most clicks. And to me, a content creator is just another way of saying FPL opinion. Like, to me, I just think content creators should be, whether they're big or small, on whether they're high production value or literally filming in their shed and doing it from their bathroom or whatever. That's
what Mark Summons does, isn't it?
Exactly. Even the best of the community are slumming it sometimes. That's the way it can go. But the point is, I think even getting people's opinions, because football's all about opinions, and that's why it transfers across to FPL. Like, if I wanted to know what, for instance, FPL Discomfort and FPL Veteran, who do the pod, they do Double Pivot, that their views on the tactical setup for Arsenal in their game coming up against Nottingham Forest, to me, that kind of transcends FPL content creator to, these are people that want to talk about FPL and football. And so that's why I think being a content creator myself, if I can call it that.
So what would you suggest instead of content creator?
Instead, I'd suggest just I don't know how to put it, but it's almost like FPL opinions or FPL fans. Just say we're all fans at heart, and obviously some people get more built up than others because they have contacts and they have people that kind of help build them up. Or they've done the work themselves to get to that stage, and that's fair enough. But ultimately, I don't think anyone should be kind of put on a pedestal above anyone else just because they've been on a show or they've got these kind of pod appearances. They're all just opinions in the space of the FPL world. So I think in general, because of the fact that I don't see content creator as such a heavy term, I then don't place that same weight on myself. Okay. Even though I'm producing content for Spotify, and we've got people that listen and tune in every week, I don't feel that pressure.
So I'm going to read into that there's not really been positives or negatives of being a content creator. There's been more positive or negatives of being involved in the community.
Yeah, I suppose that is what it is. It's community involvement, because the way I look at it is, I think people ask, does your FPL get worse when you do a podcast? And for me, I just think about my ideas more, but often what happens is I'll think about it, but I'll still play the same way that I would have previously done without the podcast. So it's just that obviously for the sake of mental health, you want your game week to go better when you talk about it on a podcast. Whereas if you have a stinker of a game week, you can kind of sulk yourself in a corner and you don't have to kind of almost drudge that back up again when you talk about it on a podcast because you don't have a one if you don't produce content. So I think it's more about a sort of mood thing than a pressure thing when it comes to producing content. And so that's why I think the podcast has helped me in terms of mood, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily made my FPL decisions worse, if that makes sense.
So that's a positive, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
And what about the thing you asked? You said you wanted to discuss the impact of the community on your personal sense of belonging, Roberto.
So this is where Juice started it really. So because I didn't have that sort of level of interaction before Juice. I mean, I had people that were sort of like set up an Instagram, direct messages and sort of like we had group chats for FPL and that sort of thing. And it was mostly, I'd message Adam about my team for the upcoming week and he'd say, oh, you've taken a -4. Why have you captained that player? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like back-to-back banter. And that's where the best FPL chats happen, in the WhatsApp groups, those sort of things. But for me, I felt a sense of belonging when almost like Juice, it sounds so cringy, but they accepted me in, if that makes sense. So like when I started interacting with them, I thought, well, I am a bit of an armchair fan, if this makes sense. Like I'm not producing, but I'm interacting, and the stuff that I say about FPL will get thrown up on a live show, through the comments, but that's as far as it goes. Whereas when they embraced me and said, oh, come on the show and, produce some content for the Watford Juicer, that sort of thing made me think, you know what, I really enjoy this. I really enjoy voicing my opinions and almost doing it affiliated with a certain FPL YouTube channel, like with FPL Juice. And that's where I started getting more of a passion for producing my own stuff on FPL Yellow Army's YouTube, because it was almost like I'd started something there. I got the ball rolling with Juice, and now I could build on that with my own stuff.
I get exactly what you mean. I think I've had exactly the same from Elite FPL, being invited on there and stuff. Yeah.
Literally, it gets more of a sense of belonging. But what I will say is I won't forget that feeling when I saw Ash and Nick in the flesh for the first time and met them face to face. That feeling was incredible, because that was when I first got invited onto a Juice show to be like an actual guest, rather than just this kind of like Zoom calls online. So that for me was actually where that was the first season. So it was the end of the 21-2 season. I think the episode for Juice was like Giroud and Not Alone or something. That was back when their shows were basically called by, they had this punditry section where they'd mash together a footballer's name and a topic for punditry. And that was the first episode I got a feeling of how amazing these people were. Like I already knew they were great, but to see them and really be part of their show, I just felt so included. And then I just thought to myself, there are some great people. There are some lovely people in this community. I want to get involved and almost not get my name out, because that sounds arrogant, but it almost like make people aware that I'm here and I'm happy to chat FPL with you if you want to, sort of thing. Like I'm a Watford fan, not many Watford fans in the community. It'd be interesting to just start up that conversation. And because I'd already built up those connections with people like Ray at Juice, people like I'm trying to think, obviously a lot of the guests that Juice had on, I'd be bantering in the chat and we'd have these kind of messages on Twitter back and forth.
I've got to say, Roberto, completely off topic, but you are the most present person in chats of FPL content ever. I'm almost disappointed if I go into a chat and you're not there.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Black Box, Juice, Elite FPL.
That's part of it. I love the interaction, and you got legends like Delia, for instance, in FPL Juice, who she does a lot of moderating for a lot of channels, like she does Black Box and that sort of thing. And to me, those people are the best people, because the ones that you almost like, you're watching a few streams each day. You're watching Elite FPL, you're watching Black Box, and they're on at different times on the same night. And then you see them across different streams on that night, and you're like, those are my FPL friends. They're my family. Like they're the people that I started this journey with. And to see those interactions is great. And so it's even better when you see it in person. And that's when in 2022, the start of that 22-23 season, I went to my first fantasy football fest, and I honestly loved it so much. I was like, how am I not going to this like every year? And I've gone to every one since, because they've just been brilliant. Like, they're just,
Is that the one that
to me,
runs like every August? I really want to
yeah,
go.
every August. Yeah, so they're so good because you get to see the kind of so-called big accounts. Obviously, people like Focal and Harry and all these big, really great guys, as fantastic content creators. But also, you see almost like the official FPL people. So you see people like Kelly Summers sometimes. You see, I think back early stages of Fantasy Football Fest, you had James Richardson go on with
I remember him. Yeah.
Jules Breach as well. Like those great people who you kind of peek behind the curtain, but you don't get to see.
Jules, what's his name? James Richardson's been around so long. He was when I was like 9 or 10 years old. He was hosting Football Italia, which was a Channel 4 1 hour like roundup of the Italian league, and he was bald and looked old then.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. Like, and that was the thing. I just felt in awe when I was at those events. I was like, these people, we're all connected by this silly game, and we're all kind of we're all here for the same reasons. And ultimately, the interactions were just so lovely. Like, it's easy to almost think, before you've gone to an event like that, we're all kind of nerds. Are we all going to just be very like antisocial? Will we just all be on our phones looking at IFPL teams like, let's lock in our teams, I don't want to talk to you? But it's completely the opposite, where there's so much interest from people in the community, because there's so many nice people in the community. There's so much interest in other people's lives, not just FPL. Like, it's just chatting, like, oh, how was your day? Those sort of things. And you'll get down to talk about topics and get deep into topics at Fest you never thought you would have done in any other sort of scenario. So that's why I love Fest. And as soon as I made those kind of connections in real life, that then boosted the online connections as well, because then you're like, okay, really enjoyed your appearance on Juice, and then ahead of the podcast, would you be happy to jump on? And that's where the two things go hand in hand. So I think that sense of belonging, as I was talking about, I'm so grateful for things like FPL Juices, like five-a-side meetups. They do stuff like FPL community like meets, that obviously Nima and Fella and the like have really done well to kind of set up. Those things are so key. And I remember I went to one in November I think it was November last year, with Planet FPL did one, and that was the first time I'd gone to like a kind of an FPL meets outside of Fest. And honestly, that made my year. That meetup, genuinely, like, it's the first time I met Steve-O. I think the first time I met Steve-O in person, I believe, and he was just brilliant. And I spoke to Mark, and he was brilliant.
I think I'm going to have to tell the next guest not to mention Steve-O, because I think he's been mentioned by me or the guest in every single of the 12 interviews. His ego must be going.
No, he deserves it. Steve-O deserves it.
He is a legend, I know.
He's such a top guy. So yeah, no, I have to say, if I didn't have that interaction with the community, and Juice is so much a key part of that, I genuinely don't know if I'd be motivated to play FPL. As crazy as that sounds, because what it starts from, FPL, is your love of playing your best mates from school and your family and stuff. But I think what keeps you going, that kind of like momentum over a season, is interaction.
Roberto, maybe could I come with you this year? If you go,
sorry,
can I meet up with you and go this year to the one in August?
Absolutely,
I definitely want to go. We'll have to set a date.
100%.
I'm just nervous about going because I've not been yet. Anyway,
mate, we'll make it happen for sure.
So I know you're starting out sort of yourself to some extent in your, I don't want to use the word now because you said you don't like it, content creator career. But what advice would you give to anyone out there who maybe is thinking about starting content but hasn't got around to it, or is scared?
No, that's a really good point. I think it boils down to something really simple for me, which is, do you love talking about FPL? And if the answer to that is yes, just make an FPL channel, because it will start off, and it's a bit like with any content creator, it will start off really poor. Like, even at people like Andy at Let's Talk FPL, he will admit that in the early days of his channel, it wasn't great. The content
my first video was fucking fantastic.
Yeah, this is the thing. You got some egos in the community. That's just the problem. But no, I'm joking, of course. But even Andy will admit that I remember I think it was the 16-17 season. He started off producing like live streams, and most of the time it was just him with a camera and the FPL site. And to be fair, that's the sort of content that I did on my channel, so I can't really slag myself off here. But with Andy, yeah, everyone starts from somewhere, and if you want to talk about FPL in your team, you don't necessarily need that high production, that high, flashing lights and sparkling cameras to then carry on. If you enjoy it enough, then the content almost makes itself in a way, because you're so engaged in enjoying the content that you play. So the best way I put it is, look at someone like Yelena. Her content on her channel is so simple, but yet so effective, because she talks through her team. She does vlogs of herself, what she does over the weekend, and how it relates to FPL. That's like the most easy way to start producing content. And if that's the same kind of if that's the maximum of where you want to go to, you don't want to then do stats, and you don't want to do previews and statistical stuff or captaincy matrix and stuff, all this complicated videos, then that's fine. If you enjoy that, and I think there's in the community, there'll be a market for that. There'll be an appetite for that sort of content.
Sorry, but yeah, I don't know. You probably haven't watched the Yelena interview because it's only been out for a few hours. But she said on that interview that she got really bored doing the sort of expected stats and that's why she went to doing the vlog stuff.
Exactly. That's part of it. So if you want to be a content creator, you don't create the content that you think will do well and you think that people will click for likes and stuff. Do the content that you enjoy doing, because then there's more chance of you being consistent with uploads, right? There's more chance of you carrying it on and actually building up a bit of a profile, because if you have regular uploads and if you enjoy doing it, it's all about your own enjoyment. If you don't enjoy what you're doing and you're just doing it as a chore, then there's no point in doing it. It's as simple as that. Like, you can just as easily get enjoyment out of the game from interacting on comment sections of podcasts or live shows than if you did your own videos. So if the content you're doing is not enjoyable, just stick to being what I like to call an FPL consumer rather than a producer. Like, you're not a creator necessarily if you don't enjoy the creation side of things. If you like both, like I've been doing and enjoying making my podcast, then I feel like I'm probably 80% consumer, which is get involved with Juice's comments and watch the stuff from afar. And then 20%, I like to make out I know what I'm talking about on a podcast and enjoy, have good fun doing it. So I think it's all about getting a balance.
Awesome. So the last two questions I have in this section before we get onto the mental health stuff, Roberto, is how did you come up with your channel names? And I'll ask you that both for FPL Yellow Army and The Form is Temporary.
Yeah, that's a great question. Funny you ask that, because when I first started watching Juice, I was just Roberto the Hornet with that original channel I had. And when I made my kind of juicer application, basically Ash messaged me. He was just like, mate, you just need to think of like an FPL handle, basically.
It has to have FPL in it, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I put that up on myself because I think everyone loves to put FPL in.
That's what I mean. It sort of has to have You can't have be an FPL person and not have FPL.
I'm just trying to think what you would say that's not FPL. Like maybe something like, Bench Boost FC or something like that. But it doesn't feel like it has the same ring to it, does it? So it's nice. But yeah, I'll admit, I sent a couple of like images to Ash early on. I was like so rookie at making sort of graphics and stuff or making images, and so I was trying to think of like a logo to put for FPL Yellow Army. And I've got to give actually a shout out to FPL Phillips, because I think it was in the summer of 2021 when I started doing this stuff with Juice. He did this thing that actually now Oscar does as well with his FPL.page, which is great, where you've got his interface and you have the option to have like kits from any season and put your own name into it and make a little like logo, that sort of thing. And that was something that FPL Phillips was doing just that summer, I believe, where he was literally saying, if you want to get a new FPL logo, just DM me and I'll sort you out. And yeah, I messaged Phillips and he was like, yeah, I love FPL Phillips' content, by the way. He's so underrated as a a producer. You know, I think I went on one of his Who Wants to Be a Millionaire like videos, and it was so fun.
Oh, is he the
Like,
one who does the quizzes? I've watched a few of them.
yeah,
Does he do the Tenable thing
he's,
as well?
yeah, he's done
Yeah,
Tenable
I've
with
seen
like
a few of them. Yeah,
Harry.
they were fun. Yeah,
They're
I,
so good. So
I
yeah,
loved
he
it.
deserves.
I remember I beat whoever was on the was answering the question. Well,
Yeah.
I knew the answer to the questions that they didn't.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, he's brilliant. He's a top guy. I'm hoping, you know, maybe some point soon we can get him on the Form Temporary, because he's a great guy. But yeah, going back to what I was saying, the logo, I made this logo, and it was literally as simple as my favourite Watford season was 18-19. That was the season we got to the FA Cup final. We finished our highest position that we'd ever finished, of 11th, and it was that iconic Delafeu like shirt that I loved. And so I produced this logo, and that's what stuck with me, you know, all this time. So it's kind of FPL Yellow Army for me, because of the amount of content creators there are that like to put FPL in. I thought, well, I want to put a Watford sort of angle in it, and I saw a few that had FPL Hornet and a few that had like FPL Yellow or FPL, I don't know, Watford or whatever. So it's trying to think of a thing that's subtle enough that suggests it's a Watford fan, but doesn't necessarily spell it out, you know, easily. So one of Watford's main chants, as basic as it sounds, is Yellow Army, Yellow Army. So I just thought to myself, well, yeah, FPL Yellow Army has a nice ring to it, and it stuck really. Now, the Formers Temporary podcast, there's a bit of a story with that, because how many times we thought of, me and Chris, when we were brainstorming ideas for the pod, it took us a while.
the full quote is Form is temporary, class is permanent, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I was trying to think of like, oh, should we get this from like a certain person to like not sponsor, but to like almost be at the start of our intro of like someone saying this quote of Form is temporary, just so it's like it shows where we got the name from.
Okay.
And I think it was Bill Shankly that said that quote, Form is temporary, class is permanent.
Really?
But a lot of people have said it over the years. Like,
yeah, I've heard it lots.
One of those. And we thought, let's try and think of something for the podcast that relates, because at that point we were thinking we might do a football and FPL podcast. Let's think of something that's both relevant to football and relevant to FPL. And so we thought, you know, thing around like form is so key to FPL, but it's also so key for saying when a player is good and they're on a bad run of form, they will easily get back to it because they've still got the class there. So that's where we thought, well, form is temporary, just had a nice kind of snappiness to it.
The class is permanent would have made it too long.
Yeah, class is permanent would have made it too long. And also, if you just had the class is permanent podcast, it doesn't feel the same sort of ring. No. And we noticed when we did look at the abbreviations of it and like the hashtags for the podcast, that we could abbreviate it to TFIT pod for the Form is Temporary pod. And that just had a really nice, like, it almost sounds a bit like a t-shirt size, like, oh, this is a T-fit t-shirt. It felt right. So we loved that. And that's what we run with. So it's funny how things develop like that, where you think, let's make something that people will like and, you know, it'd be easy to say. But I never would have thought of something like that if it wasn't for, you know, me getting helped out by Chris and us brainstorming, really.
Do you know my interview last week with Tom from Who Got the Assist came out on the same night that we did that watch along, and the number of times in that watch along Who Got the Assist was murmured by one of us to the others. I just thought it's a great name for a podcast because he's basically getting free advertisement in every single thing.
It is. And that's the thing about making an FPL podcast or making an FPL YouTube channel, is you're trying to tap into the kind of FPL, how do I put it, like popular culture in a way. Because if you put in lexical language and almost football language that resonates with your audience, that's like step one of the kind of content creation kind of aim of how people can get engaged. If you have a funny name for a podcast, like, that's why I think FPL Juice is brilliant, because not many people will associate football and FPL with juice, right? But you also look at like, oh, let's get the, you know, their slogan was always, and welcome back to FPL Juice, the latest place for all the squeeze of all the juicy bits from your favorite game, Fantasy Premier League, and those sort of things where, yeah, if I think about it deep down, do I like FPL for its like juicy bits of information? Yes. So that you've got that connection that that makes you engage with the content a lot more. And I think as soon as you get that jackpot of a name, then you've kind of got half the battle already.
Okay, last question, Roberto, before we go on to talk about mental health a bit. I always have a guess on this. I'm gonna go. I will give you a fiver if the answer to this is no. Now you're gonna make it up. Have you ever been recognised as FPL Yellow Army by someone who didn't know you as FPL Yellow Army, Roberto?
That is a very good question. I'm trying to think back, because when it comes to being around uni and walking around uni, no one's going to know from my podcast that
and FPL meets doesn't count. No, I've put a fiver on it, especially.
No, I was gonna say that I wouldn't mention that. I'm trying to think back to when like early days when I was with Juice. I'll be like, there's no point making it up a thing that didn't happen. I genuinely don't think there was a moment, because of the fact that I don't often, like when I go to a meets, for instance, I don't introduce myself and say, oh, I'm FPL Yellow Army. I say, hi, I'm Roberto, because people know me for being, I guess because it goes back into the kind of uniqueness of my name, because I'm a half Portuguese and there's not many people in the FPL community.
You sound very English, I've got to say.
Yeah, no, it doesn't come through with my accent, but my mum is full Portuguese, my dad is full English.
Yeah.
And that's part of the inspiration actually for my name was Roberto Carlos, the footballer, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
He's Brazilian.
Yeah, I know, but Brazilian Portuguese, close enough, right? But yeah, he when it comes to it, like getting like this is the thing. It's like I look at fame. I don't look at fame as an incentive. I look at it as a bonus.
The answer to this question is no, isn't it?
It pretty much is. But when I want to be a commentator, that's when I want to be noticed. Like when I'm an FPL manager, and especially if I'm doing badly at FPL, but maybe it's better if I'm not noticed.
We don't usually know who most of the commentators are, unless you're someone like John Motson or something. I mean, the radio commentators, you wouldn't know what they look like, would you?
Well, I suppose if they're a TV commentator, you're more likely to be able to spot them. If you're a radio commentator, you maybe go under the radar a little bit. But what I'm getting at here is my ultimate goal of fame, which I don't have a massive, feeling towards. But if I was famous, I'd want it to be through commentary and not through FPL. So that's why I think I'm not bothered by that sort of thing. But it's obviously lovely if someone's listened to the pod, like, I think there was one occasion actually last season where one of my mates from uni said, I saw your clip from the pod. I really enjoyed that last episode. And if I hadn't put that clip out with our faces on it, with the video clips on, then maybe they wouldn't have mentioned it to me on that day. So it's kind of like I'll get the occasional comment, but it's not one of those things I'm, hoping to get or searching for.
Do you? Because I used to want to be a commentator when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I always used to. The football game that was popular when I was actually not 9 or 10 years old, 11 or 12 was ISS Pro, which I think became Pro Evolution, and I'd always commentate on those. But I'd also watch the football matches and I'd turn them down and commentate over them, and I still believe that my commentary was better than whatever arsehole was actually commentating on the game. What do you do? Do you practice?
Oh, I love it. That's why I'm so like it's for me it's so weird, because like other mates I've had at school, at uni, and it's natural for people my age. I'm 21, but from probably the age of 9, 10, when I started getting interested in football, I've not changed in terms of what I've wanted to go on and do as a career, which is very rare. It's not often that people have that kind of one-dimensional, this is what I want to do. And that's why sports journalism to me was so key to get me into that, because you can't do a university course on football commentary, right? So you have to have a way in. But for me, I get that buzz when I hear people like Alistair Bruce-Ball, who's fabulous commentator on BBC, BBC radio, and you hear Peter Drury and his prep, and Clive Tilsley, he's got his kind of like notes mapped out with all the kind of details of the matches. For me, that excites me. Like a lot of people would see that as hard work to prep a game for the weekend, and you've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday to do every single stat under the sun that seems relevant about one player's record against another club. To me, that is like if I could do that for free, I would do it. So if I can then get a career in being a football commentator, then I think I've won at life. So that's why I want to pursue that, because it's something that I really find engaging.
Yeah, it's. I was saying, I can't remember which interview it was. I think it was Steve-O. There was a competition when I was about 10 years old on a show called Games Master, which I doubt you'd ever heard of.
Yeah.
And it was basically a competition, and you had to send in a clip of FIFA or ISS Pro. I think this may have been the first ever FIFA with you commentating over it. And the award was you got to meet John Motson commentate on the game. And I didn't see it when I was a kid. I saw it on a retrospective of Games Master, and I was like, oh my God, why didn't I see that? Okay, so we'll move on now, Roberto, to sort of the mental health part of the interview. I keep calling it mental health. It's really FPL and mood. Just a reminder to the viewers, I've written this in because I never say this midway through. Please like and subscribe if you are enjoying the video. So mental health, as you know, Roberto, is a little bit of a focus of the channel. So I've got some past videos where I've got one specifically on mental health and FPL tips from a psychologist, which is from me, but also the more general videos I make, like deadline streams. Is your overall rank important? Should we listen to YouTube people, which are kind of my solo rants, do have a bit of a mental health focus. So the first question I ask you, Roberto, and I usually split this one up into sort of two questions. Has FPL ever had an effect on your mental health / mood? I think mood is probably becoming, as I'm doing these interviews, it's becoming that's more the predominant thing. Yeah. But then again, mental health and mood, they are sort of the same thing to some extent. And maybe you can answer that first of all as a player, taking out the content creation part of it, and then secondly as a content creator, if you get me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is very simple for me. 100% it has negatively, and it's the ugly truth, I have to admit it, that it genuinely made me feel very, very, and it took the enjoyment away out of watching games when FPL was, like, when the extremes happened, I didn't enjoy the football, which to me, now I think back to it, like, that disgusts me genuinely.
So when was this, when you're first getting in or getting serious?
This would have been, I'm trying to think the peak year of when it was. I think it was, it was the 22-23 season. Yeah, it was that season. It was the season after I had quite a nice finish, I think, in 21-22 compared to like previous years. So that season in 21-22, I finished 109k, which was my highest finish. And I was thinking, right, let's break into that top 100k. We're on the up here with our ranks. And that season in 22-23, obviously, it felt really tough because there were a lot of double game weeks, a lot of kind of blanks, and it was quite chaotic. But I just remember that season so much about how the template was really, really strong. And I played the game with my heart on my sleeve at times, where I would do things that I'd believe in, but then I'd second guess myself. And I remember so vividly, I think it was around March, April time, Roberto, that season.
I'm just going to... Hello, we're back. Sorry, we just had a little bit of a technical issue there. Sorry, Roberto, you were saying, man.
Yeah, so I just remember so vividly that I think it was around March, April time. It was basically that game. I think it was the game week 26, and I wild carded. And it was the week after a double game week, I believe. It was a double game week 25, I think, and then there was like a double coming up after that. But basically, in game week 26 or so, I wild carded. I took out the two Liverpool boys. I had Darwin Núñez and Salah, and it was ahead of that.
You're asking for trouble with Darwin Núñez.
I know. No, I had Darwin Núñez, and he'd done nothing for me. That previous week, I think he had a double, and he got scored against Wolves, and it got disallowed, and it was just awful. And I watched the Liverpool Man United game, just hoping for a good football match, firstly. But when you remove both Salah and Darwin, you don't expect to see them get something like 25 points between them. And
Was this against Man United?
yeah, it was the 7-0.
I did
And
something very similar. I remember. Yeah.
And I won't forget the feeling of watching that football match. And obviously, take away FPL, that's one of the best football matches you're likely to see.
Mm.
But watching that game, I felt like a different person. I didn't feel like Roberto watching a football match. I felt like not content creator, because back then I wasn't doing loads of podcasts and FPL juice videos, but the occasional. But the point is, I was more FPL addict. That's how I felt back then. I didn't feel like Roberto, the football fan. And I just remember the feeling of like dread, that feeling of it just felt like, so low after that game, despite it being a 7-0. And it was just like, I don't want to feel like this again. And there was a couple of times that season that I felt the same way, where because I think that week of the wild card, it was an absolute like stinker of a wild card. I think I got like 32 points on wild card, took out all my points. I had players like Maddison. I think he got like a 1-pointer against Southampton away, and I benched like McAllister for a 14-pointer. Like that week was a shambles of a game week. And then a couple of other times I just did stupid things that season. But then my mood picked up at the end of that season, and I ended up, funnily enough, securing my best rank that season. Nice. So it's how everything changes with mental health and mood very, very quickly. And the same thing applies to FPL, where, I think it was the end of that season, there was, as I said, a lot of doubles. And those doubles at times were pain, because I'd bring in players with doubles and they'd get like 0 points, like Tarkovsky, I think he did in the double game.
That was the season the Queen died and there was loads of doubles and stuff.
It was. Yeah, exactly. That's the one. And I think at the end of that season, like players like McAllister, for instance, I remember him scoring a late penalty against Man United, for instance. That saved my season. Those sort of things. And it ended well. But I don't kind of appreciate that rank without the middle of the season being as bad as it was.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point, because the research that I've done on fantasy football and mental health shows that the more engaged you are, basically, the more it can affect your mental health / mood negatively, but it equally shows that it can affect your mood and mental health positively. So it is kind of the swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
Because if you look at my rank of 18.795 that season, at 18k, you wouldn't have known the struggles. Thank you. You wouldn't have known the struggles of that season that I had mid-season. Well, as I was referring to. So it just shows how FPL, and that's the thing about FPL, is it is a bit like a drug, because you play it hurts you, and then some weeks you feel good from it, and so that kick keeps you going. And as weird as that sounds, there's almost like this pursuit of something that's not achievable with FPL, where you're going to lose most weeks, you're going to get battered in where it hurts most weeks, but there will be the odd week where you feel like you're on top of the world, even though you're playing with another 11 million managers. So I think that's what FPL does to you, is it promises you something that at the start of the season you're like, right, this could be my year. I finished top of the world, and then the shattered dream is gone by game week 3's wildcard.
I never have that thought.
Literally, I shouldn't fool myself every season, but I always do. But it's amazing how FPL is obviously so reliant on results, and results do dictate our mood, even though they shouldn't. And a lot of people talk about, if you're happy with a transfer and the logic you used to get to a transfer, you should just be happy with the process and the decision making. But it's easier said than done to do that, because it's a very results based game. So I think what I've learned, which I'm very happy about from an own kind of personal sense of growth in a way, is the last couple of seasons, certainly much more this season. The season, and this has actually been one of my most painful seasons I've actually had, because rank-wise, obviously, I'm having a bit of a tough season. I had a good game week, but this is like only about the 4th or 5th week in the whole season I've been inside the top million. So it's been a slog, and it's been harder, I think, this season than any other.
Can I cut you a second, Roberto? I said to Steve-O when I was on there the other night, a lot of it is perspective. So I was down in 5 million I think when I started this interview series, which is only about a month ago, and I'm
Yeah,
up to 500,000 now. But that feels great for me because I've just been going up and up and up. Whereas
yeah,
Steve-O, I think, was like 400,000, and it's been going down and down and down. So a lot of
literally.
it's like a million. Being in the top million is not bad for. I don't know. I'm trying to FPL therapy here. Sorry about
Yeah.
interrupting. Yeah,
No, it's all good because it's all about perspective, isn't it? Like
yeah.
game week 6, when I wildcarded 2.5 million, like between game weeks 1 and 6, I hadn't changed between 1.9 to 1.2 to 2.1. Like I was just going up and down, up and down. I wasn't moving anywhere. And then the last 4 weeks, I've gone from 1.2 to 821, back up but to 825, back down to 844, and then up to 684 this week. So it just shows that it's all about perspective. But going back to what I was saying about mental health, this year I've managed to control my emotions a lot more. So when a bad thing happens and I've transferred out, for instance, you even have to look at last game week, midweek when we were doing the watch along with Elite FPL. I was covering the Newcastle Liverpool game, right? I'd sold Isak as part of a -4 for Jackson, who
Yeah,
was
so
playing
do I,
in,
yeah.
right? When that Isak goal goes in, I obviously say, "Oh, Isak scored," and then I can't but help but say, "Oh, and I took out him for Jackson," and that's the thing. Is like it's part of our natural reaction, but previously in previous seasons, I would have let that affect me. Whereas now I almost like I embrace the pain of the game because I've gone through enough bad game weeks. It's got to a stage where I'm not just thinking, what am I doing? Why am I wasting my time on this stupid game? I'm now thinking part of the weirdly enough enjoyment of the game is you get served up a lot of poo every game week. The game weeks that you don't get that served up to you is a bigger achievement. Like back in the day, back in my day when I had a good season in 20 to 21, I remember that season, like if you got 60 points in a game week, that was a pretty good week. Whereas now the average is like at least 50, 58, 56, 57 every week. So the standard is so much higher. So now it's almost like the expectation levels are lower.
The
So now I think I'm happy with less, if that makes sense.
I call this. I mean, I loosely call this podcast, whatever you want to call it, FPL Meet the Manager, FPL Content Creator, whatever. But I
Yeah.
always put in the thumbnail, so and so's FPL journey, and I think I've been on that journey that you have been, where you get really pissed off, and in about season 4 or 5 of me playing, I almost quit, and then
Yeah.
started to take it less seriously and enjoy the
Yeah.
negatives. If
Well,
that
like
makes sense.
you say that, you say enjoy it and take it less seriously. I've never got to a stage where I've taken it less seriously. And that's part of my problem is,
Okay.
as I said, I can't seem to turn off. Like once I'm on it. But what I have done is I've managed to find coping mechanisms for when it does go badly. Whereas before I would just literally like feel to myself, I do it now where I do think to myself, like in the space of a week, how much energy I put into this game. And then you get people that are ranked like 200 in the world. They've not made a transfer all season. You think, like, why do I bother? Sometimes, why do I bother with this
The dead
game? Because
teams, the dead teams.
the more changes I seem to make a lot of times this season, the seasons I've got green arrow, the weeks I've got green arrows have been weeks that I've rolled. Like the weeks I've made transfers, it's actually gone worse. So sometimes you do have to think to yourself, yeah, like you are spending way too much time on this stupid game. But also, the reason I'm spending time with it is not because I am just addicted to the point where I can't stop myself. It's also because I enjoy the process of interacting and producing content and speaking to people. So there is benefits to doing it. There's also downsides, but that doesn't mean I'll stop because I still think the benefits slightly outweigh the downsides.
So, but I think we've kind of talked through there. Most of that was related to you being a player, and appreciate you sharing your experiences. Does being a content creator, or has it changed the mental health perspective in a good way or a bad way?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I slightly touched on this earlier because of the thing about mood. So it's more a thing of like if I go on the podcast and say, "Guess what, guys? I got my 3rd red arrow in a row. Should we just end the pod because I'm not really giving anything to this podcast. You know, at this point, like someone else could host it at this stage.
You're
No,
learning. You're learning from You're learning from Steve.
maybe Steve-O's getting in my head. Maybe that's what it is. Like he's rubbing off on me. But no, I do agree with what a lot of Steve-O says about that, because you do think to yourself, like I'm actually, especially I think it applies to hosts of podcasts. So like as someone who, you know, helped create, or, you know, is the main creator of the pod, I then feel more responsibility when it isn't going badly. Whereas someone like Chris, obviously he's my co-host, but he's kind of agreed to it, and I proposed it. So I think if the pod ended tomorrow,
So
I think Chris will.
That you're the host, or
Well, I'm like the way I'd phrase it is, if you think of Fantasy 606 with Alistair Bruce Ball, Chris Sutton, and Statman Day, which I love, by the way. They're the people that I listen to without fail every game week.
Okay, I've never actually listened to that. I've never actually listened to that.
Oh, it's really good. I definitely kind of recommend. Well, the way I'd phrase it is I feel like a bit like Ali with the Form is Temporary, where Ali will be the guy kind of leading it. He'll pose the questions. He'll host the pod mostly. He'll be the anchor man, really. Whereas you've got then Dave, who does his kind of FPL tips, and he's what they call the expert.
So
again,
a bit of friend. Is he even an FPL player? He didn't make his name from the FPL, did he?
No, it's Statman Dave. So he does like statistical posts on like social media about Premier games and that sort of thing, and other competitions as well. So he's been on 606. You know, basically.
I watched the sorry mate, I watched the. Do you play Football Manager?
No, I don't.
He appeared. There was a Football Manager World Cup, which is really weird. You know, a bit like the FIFA thing, but the first one was this summer, and he was there as an expert commentator, and I'm like, this guy just appears everywhere. Sorry, mate,
it is amazing. No, it's all good. So going back to that, you've got Ali he's the main anchor. You've got Dave is the kind of stats guy and the FPL giver of advice, and then you've got Chris, who's the maverick, who everyone loves to hear his wacky ideas. So he manages his team with his son, which is really, really fun, because they're called Taylor, right? So his son Taylor. That they make out that he's like Brian Clough and he's like the main manager, and then he's got Taylor like giving him advice and helping him with captaincy and that sort of thing. So it's really interesting. So you get all these different sides to the podcast, and that's what we've got a bit with Form is Temporary, where obviously last season when Jack was around, he was like almost the producer. He was almost a bit like James with FPL Juices. He's the guy, you know, behind the scenes doing a lot of the producing, and then you got the host. And I felt like a lot of the time, because I was asking the questions to the guests, I'm like helping to host. Chris is giving his stats and giving his opinions. So with regards to that, I think the mental health side of things, if the pod finished tomorrow and ended, I think I would be more mental health impacted by it than Chris would be. Just because I think, because it's almost like, it feels like it sounds selfish to say this, but it almost feels a bit like my baby I've created. Whereas Chris obviously he's agreed to it and he's helping to co-host it with me, and he's, you know, obviously asking questions, but it does feel like, I've kind of started up the idea. So I feel responsible much more for it than I think maybe other people that have been on the pod do. So because of that, I do it to help my own enjoyment, but also I don't think it's like, if there's weeks that I miss out the pod, I do look forward to the next pod even more, but I also it doesn't affect me as maybe other content creators might do, where they say, oh no, we're not going to produce content, that's our listeners down the bin. Like for us, we'll just pick it up the next week, so it's not as much of an issue.
Awesome. So what advice would you, I mean, you sort of said about coping mechanisms yourself, but what advice would you give to anyone who's struggling with their mood or mental health this season as a result of FPL?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously tough, because I don't want to be here and sitting here and say this is how you should behave, because everyone deals with these kind of results differently. Like, I think it's important that there isn't a one size shoe fits all sort of strategy, but just make sure you are transparent with your loved ones and with your like friends about how it affects you, because if you hide that, that's where the kind of slippery slope start, where if you don't show that side to you around your family and friends when you're not playing FPL, it can get to a point where you're so reliant on, like, if you're not enjoying even your interactions with family and friends because in your head you're thinking about FPL, then when you get to away from family gatherings and you get away from that interaction with your family and then you're watching games and you're looking at FPL, it almost becomes the point where your emotions are so heavily reliant on that FPL that if it goes badly, then you feel lower than ever. So I think it's so important to get a healthy balance of, right, that's enough FPL for today. Let's switch off. Like, we don't have to burn out here because it's like everything with everything. You've got to take it in moderation. And so when your game is getting too much, just don't engage with X. Don't engage with Blue Sky. Don't watch streams to compound the misery even further. Just know when to switch off. It's like with a Netflix thing, right? If you're hooked on a Netflix film and you're watching it and your appetite for it is so unhealthy that it's actually obstructing other things in your own personal life, like, just Netflix is not forcing you to click on the next episode. You just gotta turn it off. So I think it's not easy, and it's easier said than done when you're not in that situation and kind of entangled in it. But I think I'd say just be transparent with your loved ones and let them know, so that it almost like they can help you to be yourself, be your true self, because that's ultimately what you should always be.
Sorry if there's a slight cut there in the edit viewers. There was a slight technical issue on my end. Yeah, it was interesting what you're saying there. I was talking to, because some people might think, what's Roberto talking about? Like, do people really have issues with their family and stuff because of FPL? And I can say that it's certainly very true. I was just in a conversation with, I won't name the person, but someone very, very keen FPL member of the community who was saying, thankfully now he doesn't, but used to have real issues with, how his mood would influence his interactions with his family and friends over the weekend, because he was just so pissed off if his team did badly.
Yeah, I do think with that, one thing I will say is, as much as people say that X is a toxic place, I think X has been so key to help my mental health when it comes to bad things in FPL. So
please explain.
With what I was saying with like that Salah Darwin thing, right? I was on Twitter, don't get me wrong, but I was in a headspace where I wouldn't even think about ranting about that on Twitter. Whereas nowadays, if I've done something on Twitter, or on FPL, sorry, and then talked about it on Twitter, the chances are the people that are following me, they've probably done the same thing. So then they'll respond to a tweet or an X post I put out and saying, mate, I did the same thing. Like, this is FPL. What can we do? It's a funny game, isn't it? And that makes my coping strategy so much easier because you feel like you're in a collective sense of just belonging, in terms of not belonging in terms of self, but belonging in terms of the game itself and the wider concept of the game, that we're all just trying our best and ultimately it's out of our hands.
You realise you're to put it in a crude way, you realise you're not the only twat that made that mistake.
Literally, exactly. We're not the only one. I'm not the only one that's a fool for doing that in FPL. So it makes you feel so much better. Whereas, funnily enough, I had a different view on that altogether in that sort of 22, 23 season, where I'd say if I engaged with that, that would just make me spiral more. But now it's a way of kind of making it all right when everyone else experiences the same pain. It's a bit like, I mean, obviously it's not as extreme as something like grieving, right? Because obviously that's a different planet, and this is only a game we play for a hobby. But as a simile, you can put it as people, when they experience pain, they can get through it when people feel related to each other and feel kind of at one with each other. And when it comes to FPL, that I think transpires as well. So yeah, it's that. I mean, obviously, when everyone copies each other and then they do badly, that's a different feeling entirely. And that herd mentality is not a good thing. But in terms of the herd kind of sharing of pain, let's put it, distributing the pain among other fellow community members, then that makes the pain a bit more easy to swallow, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really use Twitter, as you know. I only created my account when I opened the channel, but I do. I am more likely, like Let's Talk FPL Andy says, that he has a lot less viewers when it's been a bad game week for most people. But that's the time that I do listen to him because I
Mm.
want to hear, especially if he's fucked up, as well as me. You know what I mean?
Kind of like on that stage, we'd say if that sort of level of content creator is struggling,
Mm.
like you kind of take your game week with a pinch of salt because you think to yourself, like, who is actually doing well here? Is it the casuals that are not looking at their team? And that's the sort of game week that we've just had. You know, if that's reflected in those scores, you kind of think, well, it's out of my hands. I've given enough energy for it. I've done good transfers, but I've not been rewarded by it. It doesn't necessarily make me a bad FPL player. It's just sometimes the game can do that to us, and it can be a bit cruel. So yeah, I think it's important to see context and see how everyone else is doing. Not always. I think it can get too much in our back of our heads, and we make transfers sometimes just to be different to other people. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Like I'm one that's a bit of a sucker for a differential to the point where it does kill me sometimes. Like for instance, recent example, Ike Nori. I didn't pick him a few game weeks back because I thought, oh, I could gain an edge here with Semedo, and he got a couple of assists before that Brighton game. So I thought, well, yeah, he's really low owned. You know, let's try and chase that upside. And in that time, Ike Nori scored a goal, and assist, and Semedo's done diddly squat from attack and returns point of view. So it's just important to sometimes know when a player is a good enough pick to not just go differential for the sake of trying to gain an edge. Sometimes you just got to pick the better players. But I also do have a passion for trying to do things a bit differently.
Yeah. So next question I usually ask people, last sort of mental health question, and you've watched a few of these, haven't you, Roberta? So hopefully you've had time to think about it. Do you think there are any changes FPL, and not just FPL? You know, there's lots of other fantasy games out there like Fan Team. Is that the new one?
Yeah,
Telegraph and all those.
yeah.
What do you think they could do to help them? You know, the content providers themselves could do to content providers. The FPL,
Like FPL Towers.
yeah, FPL towers, they could do to help the mental health base of their players.
That's a good question because it's funny actually. I looked into this because I was trying to think of things I could do for a documentary. So I'm looking to do a documentary for my uni course of like some sort of newsworthy angle that's interesting. And you know, you talk about betting and the kind of
Can I,
mental.
sorry, can I talk about that a minute? Because we exchanged a few messages that
Yeah,
because Roberto knows that I've done research on mental health, and you asked me if anyone's committed suicide or been what was the other one? Gone
it's
into
like affected by it in a way that kind of hurts their mental health. And I looked into it, and basically
was this
it's
the same project? Sorry.
so what I was going to say was with the dissertation, I looked at the impacts of FPL on mental health, and basically, majority of the time, it's not got thankfully enough, touch wood, hopefully it doesn't in the future. It not got to that stage, but what I will say is, I thought about what would be a good idea for a documentary.
Sorry, but I'll just say not that I know of.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of course,
yeah,
of
yeah.
course. What would be a good idea for a documentary? And that's what I thought of was the impact on mental health, because when you talk about sort of like why it's important that we kind of think about how we play this game, it can have a huge impact on people in a very number of ways. So you can't just like categorize people in the same kind of categories. You've got to allow people to play the game how they want to, and I think part of that comes into um, thinking about playing the game in a safe manner, really, playing it properly. And once you don't play it in a safe manner, you've got to tap out a bit like with betting. So to answer your question, I think
So, sorry, Roberta. So, what would the documentary be about? I'm
so. The documentary
I'm
thing
wondering if I can
was
tie this into something that I'm thinking about. But
yeah. So I've kind of thought of now doing kind of betting and the impact of betting on sort of like younger people now, because I think there's more kind of scope of getting those kind of thoughts and interests on that. But when it comes to FPL, I think personal experience is key. So what was the kind of question you had at the start about that?
What could FPL themselves or other
Oh
content
yeah,
creators
what
do
could they
to help
do
their
to
mental health
improve
goals?
that? So I think, oh yeah, that was why I was talking about betting. So betting for me, obviously, you've got like betting nowadays, it comes with a warning, right? So you got Be Gamble Aware, you got all these adverts.
Mm.
The Premier League in recent years, especially this season, the number of betting adverts, I'm pretty sure they said that they were going to reduce them, for instance, in TV, televised games, but they seem to have just gone up. It seems to have just gone the other way, where now even at games, obviously billboards around the kind of the pitch, there's adverts about betting everywhere you look. You got Premier League sponsors; they're all kind of betting. It's just all consuming. It's so much to the point where it's affecting young people now. I think FPL should have the same, like almost warning, almost like a kind of when you start a team and you make a team, it almost has like a precursor of play this game, but be aware that there are potential, obviously not everyone will take FPL that seriously, but potential mental health impacts of the game, because it is very much like betting of I'm going to back this horse, I'm going to back this player to score this many assists in this game or register this many assists. And although you don't have the same financial investment into the game, from an emotional point, when you want to do well and it doesn't go well, that affects your mood naturally. So I think FPL, to help the mental health side of things, obviously it's only in extreme cases because the majority of people are able to, luckily most people are able to kind of manage it. It's
But
not
but
necessarily
we'd hope the same with gambling, wouldn't we? But there's always going to be those few.
yeah, there is going to be those few, and that's absolutely natural. And not everyone can, necessarily have the same experience. It's all personal. But I would say to help the majority when it comes to FPL and mental health, yeah, maybe just some like warning signs and maybe some advice on the FPL website. You look at certain sites on gambling sites. They don't often have like steps of this is what you should do when you start showing symptoms of it's starting to get worse. Maybe FPL could just say that. Just have a like little tab that if people are struggling, not firstly step away from the
It's a really
game
good idea.
because it's only a game. But secondly, these are the ways you can kind of help to risk manage the situation, because I think it's so important to stop it getting to that dangerous stage and almost cutting it at source early. And maybe the FPL website could help to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean posts on X from official FPL's account, because unfortunately there'll be a lot of people, a lot of kind of insensitive people that will comment stuff like, it's only a game. We don't care about mental health. It's not going to affect us, but it might affect some people. So I think you've just got to cater for the majority and maybe have something on the site that could help fulfill that.
Yeah, that's a really good. That's a really good point. And I was going to pick up on that. I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, we don't want to make FPL woke or something," by worrying
Yeah,
about mental health. But the gambling adverts, the gambling companies have them there. If you don't want to read them or you don't want to take the advice, you just ignore it. This is it'll be exactly the same on the FPL website.
yeah.
And something I'll mention it now, Roberto. I have no idea what I'm going to do with this yet, but I don't know if you've listened to the Patreon stream I did with Elite FPL.
I haven't got around to it, but
One of
yeah,
the videos I'm planning is I'm going to email the Premier League with my doctor in psychology who studies FPL thing with a list
yeah.
of changes that have come up in these interviews, and I might also do something if I can get, I don't know, maybe Raptor or someone to share it online. He probably won't. To try and
You
do
never know.
something. So yeah, but
Yeah.
that would be a good idea. Any other things you think they could change?
I think one other thing, I mean, this is less of a mental health thing and more of a kind of engagement thing.
Yeah,
I think Stevo has mentioned it before, and I definitely agree with him about just transparency with certain things. One of the things is obviously price rises, and it does get on my nerves that we're having to rely on fantastic, I have to say, like fantastic data sort of like models from like live FPL who actually are successfully predicting the price changes
yeah,
before
yeah,
they happen.
yeah.
Like it's the fact that they've managed to now perfect that system, that kind
That's
of
right, mate.
algorithm.
Yeah, Steve, I did mention that one. I've yet to check out. Which one is it on?
on the live FPL Twitter account.
And it's 100% accurate.
Well, obviously everything isn't 100%, but it's like the success rate of this season has been really quite impressive. Like for instance, you look at the last one they've got on their pinned tweet. They're predicting Trent to go up, players like João Pedro to go up, players like Saliba to go up, and all of them went up on the 7th of December. So, for instance, that sort of thing, it's incredible to have that level of, out of all the price changes, that level of success. But official FPL, they don't even need to say this player is definitely going up or definitely going down, because obviously the way the prices change, it's volatile because it's depending on players bought and sold, right? So even if a player doesn't go up, I guess that's maybe why official FPL don't do it, because they say, what if they tweet out that João Pedro's looking like he might go up, and then he doesn't go up, and then you've got potentially a lot of managers saying, oh, I brought in João Pedro because you said this. And then it's potentially, if João Pedro gets injured in a training session before deadline, then you'll think, well, they've just shot themselves in the foot, official FPL there. So I can understand it from that perspective, but from a kind of awareness perspective, there isn't enough of it when it comes to price changes. The other thing I'd say that official FPL should do, that should change the way they present the game, I would say another thing of transparency is be transparent when it comes to people's transfers in and transfers out, because from weeks in, like every so often, they'll often say, oh, Nicholas Jackson is the most transferred in player ahead of this game week. Will he do well ahead of the weekend, right? But then they'll also miss out things like, who are the most sold players as well as the most transferred in. So you can kind of get that kind of comparison between the two. I think sometimes they'll spin certain narratives at certain weekends where they'll say, oh, let's lead with the most highly captain player, and then the next week it'll be the most sold player. But I think having a bit more of a kind of overall collective view of just it doesn't have to be complicated, but it's just most transferred in, most transferred out, most captained, most vice captained, because they've got probably the data for this stuff and they don't always disclose all of it. So maybe just giving managers a bit of a bigger picture. And I get that a lot of that stuff they won't be able to get until after deadline. But if they can get majority of it before deadline, because there's enough data from the previous game week that can kind of be posted out, I just think that will help managers make those 50-50 calls. Because if you're in like a 50-50 decision between two players at a similar price, and you've seen that lots of managers are selling, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to dictate a decision, but lots of managers selling a certain player, you might think, well, is there a logic that sees this player's form is actually dropping off, and I didn't quite look in deep enough in how bad that player is looking in terms of projections going forward. That might just be the kind of tipping point for a lot of people's transfers to get that overall picture.
Awesome. So usually finish, Roberto, just asking how your season's going and that. So how is your season going? And I've made a note here that one thing you said you wanted to talk about in the interview was to discuss your, I've just got it noted here, is managerial style.
Yeah. I mean, I briefly touched on it earlier, but differential is basically where it kind of starts with. I am a sucker for a differential because for me, there's no better feeling in FPL than when you
define differential.
For me, it's funny because early on in my FPL playing, it was anyone under 20% owned. And now in the last maybe 3 or so seasons, it's anyone under 10% owned.
Okay.
So because of the kind of how much the game is now, how broad and how mainstream it is, it's harder and harder to find differentials. Because back in the day when you had your John Lundstroms, you did a bit of research, only a small bit of research from the great guys at Scout, and they looked at, pre-season minutes, and then you jump on that differential and he turns into the next OOP defender. He was
amazing, wasn't he, old Lundstrom?
Oh, the best. The king, honestly, alongside Salah, the king. But nowadays, because of how saturated FPL is as a game, you can jump on quickly to those differentials, but you're not going to be the only one doing it. So it's kind of like they don't become differential very quick. They lose their differential status very quickly. But as I said with, like, for instance, Semedo, it does come at a cost where I'm always looking for the next differential. And I look at my team. Sometimes it's more of an aesthetic thing where if I look at my team and I don't see a player under 10% owned in that first 11, I'm like, this week's going to be boring, isn't it? Like, I don't like it. So if I've got a free transfer going, like, for instance, I'll mention recently I brought in Timber, right? Now, of course, the painful thing about that is the last few weeks, Saliba's scored.
Can I just say we both bought in Timber because you took the credit for that on the live stream, and I bought him in.
I was trying desperately to basically gloat that as much as possible and try and create a narrative that I was the Timber starter. But I know you did as well. I know you had him as well. But I was just like, oh, let's just let's try and get glory from this one. No,
sorry, mate. You're saying.
In all seriousness, yeah, that right there's points where I bring in differentials, I enjoy it, and then there's always like some little thing that takes the gloss off of it. And that was one of the things where, in that game against Man United, Saliba also scores the weirdest goal, off his bum basically, and he gets snatching the bonus points off Timber, and he does the same thing in the Fulham game, and Timber obviously does nothing. And I think to myself, like, would I pick Saliba if I hadn't have been such a differential hunter these last couple of weeks? 100%. And then I would have got more points on it. But there are the other times where, for instance, I think it was the 23-24 season. That season I, had a good season. The season before that, which I had one of my best ranks of 18K, the reason for that was differentials. So, like, if I hadn't, I think I did it a thread on that 22-23 season where I made sure I picked someone under 10% owned every game week, and it helped me with my rank. So
would this include early season?
Yeah, literally game week 1. I remember, I think it was Kulusevski against Southampton at home, 13-pointer, like game week 1 of that 22-23 season. So if you don't go for those differentials, I find it hard. Certainly FPL back then, I found it hard to make gains.
No one was recommending Kulusevski in game week 1, were they?
Exactly. And that kick you get out of a differential is my favorite thing. That's why I think I've struggled so much with this season, because whereas last season you had your players like your Hwang, who I got on early on wildcard, and he was so good for Wolves, and I got on these differentials and they really saved my season. This season, I just feel like it's not the season for differentials. And we actually have a segment on our Formers Temporary podcast where we give 3 differentials each week, right? And my record on that, considering I'm, on every podcast, I don't miss a one, like, it's pretty shocking this season. Like, I've only got about 7 correct players out of how many game weeks we've been in now? 14, 15. So I'm basically suggesting, actually, to be fair, we started later on in the season about game week 4. So it's probably been, give or take, about 10, 11 game weeks. So that's about 33 players I've suggested. And out of those 33, only 7 of them have come through with returns. That just shows like how tough this season's been with differentials. So that's why.
Sorry, but that reminds me. They used to have a section in the scout cast that they don't have anymore. They'd all pick a differential week. I can't remember what they called the section now. If anyone remembers, please comment please put it in the comments. But it was really good. So I like that your podcast does some like old school sort of stuff as well.
We try and be old school and try and have some fun stuff, interactive stuff as well, like listener questions and that sort of thing. But going back to that differentials thing, that's why I've struggled this season, because I've not had that run of bringing in players and them doing well for me. When I've got in the differentials, they've mostly, other than Timber, who obviously scored against Man United, they've mostly failed. Like Lewis Hall, who's done absolutely nothing for me. He was under 10% owned. So sometimes I do go to it to the extent where it ruins my team. But in terms of my season so far, as I said, it's been a slow moving one. I mean, I didn't get out inside the top million till literally game week 12. Like, I was 1.9, 2.5, and the wild card was part of the problem, right? So wild card in game week 6, and I was going into that week off the back of a nice green in game week 5 up to 1.4 million. I was thinking, right, this is where my season starts.
That was a nightmare week. Everyone that was like, I went down as well. Yeah.
And that's the funny thing, is like, this often happens with me where I get lured into a certain game week to wildcard, and that game week 26 one that I was talking about that season, I think there was another one. I'm trying to think which season it was now. I think it was game week. Was it game week 10 or something. There was basically one of the early periods for the wild
Do,
card.
do you decide?
Everyone,
Do you decide beforehand when to wildcard, or do you do it on the fly?
yeah, I literally decide it before the season starts sometimes.
Okay.
Like, for instance, that game week 6 one, I was like, I looked at the fixture swing, I was like, Brentford, Arsenal, I'm doing it then. And I just decided that. But it doesn't obviously help when you've got loads of other content creators saying, you know what, game week 6 is a great time to play the wild. And then, of course, it goes absolutely shockingly 37 points. And I took out, again, players that scored points. I took out my likes of Salah, and he did well in that time. It was really, really tough. And so based on that, I hadn't moved much further in that time. But I've been up and down. I've been green, red, a couple reds, a couple greens, a couple reds. Like, it's been that sort of like tough to move anywhere. But the last few weeks, I mean, I got a couple of back-to-back greens, a couple of back-to-back reds, and luckily I got a green this week to stop myself from getting a third red in a row. So tough season. I've had to be much more patient this season, because if it had been a previous season and this was where I was by game week 15, 684k, I think I probably would have not thrown in the towel, but I would have started to go, on tilt a little bit. But because I've kind of got those coping mechanisms now, and I've got coping mechanisms sound dramatic, but what I will say is I embrace the chaos more now, whereas I laugh it off. Whereas before I didn't laugh it off, and I took it to heart a lot more. Whereas now, getting involved with the community and speaking about how terrible this season's been for most managers, even the content creators are struggling this season. So it makes you feel better when a season is that nature, really.
So, last question I generally ask people, Roberto, is just, we're going traditional FPL content here. What advice would you give someone to become a better player, basically?
I think in terms of, I mean, I can take it from both angles, I guess. One, from a content creator's perspective, to be a better FPL manager as a content creator, I think you have to listen to yourself. And that sounds weird, because a lot of the time, the interaction that content creators get, that's part of why they enjoy it. But I listen to Steve-O, and he always talks about this, where if he trusts his gut, he often does well. But when he listens to the chat or listens to poll, like Alf, who does some great streams, he's really, fun in terms of his interaction with the community, and he does polls. And he was saying about the other week, like, he was going to captain Brian and Bumo. He does a poll, and he changes his mind based on that poll. And if he goes with his gut, he'll be a better FPL manager. So sometimes I think listening to your own thoughts, as much as it's hard when you've got lots of pods you want to enjoy and listen to, I would always say, write down your transfer thoughts, like the Monday after the game week's finished,
yes,
or the Tuesday after, because that's your initial gut instinct. And then maybe come back to it by Friday, Saturday, when the deadline is, and tell yourself truly how much has actually changed. Like, has enough happened in the Champions League, or has enough happened in midweek for that initial gut feeling to be a bad move? If the answer to that is yes, then that's when you can start taking inspiration from podcasts you've listened to.
Sorry, but what do you think? I completely agree with that. It's really great advice. What do you think of early transfers? Are you pro or nay?
Oh, it's funny you say this, because I am the most bland, boring manager when it comes to transfers, because I got scarred by an experience in 2021. So it was Villa against Burnley. I remember it so well. And the game got called off about an hour and a half before the deadline. An hour and a half before kickoff, I should say. It got called off, and I brought in Watkins for a game at home to Burnley. I thought, yeah, that'll be fine. And he didn't have a game. So I could have taken a hit.
That was the COVID one. I did exactly the same, and I was doing a lecture. It was Tuesday evening, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I was
doing a lecture, so I couldn't.
Yeah,
like I didn't.
Leeds played Arsenal on that same. You know what it was? I think it actually was a Saturday, because I think that week was already a reduced fixture list, and I seem to remember there was only like a few games. There was the evening Leeds Arsenal game, and then maybe a couple games or one or two games on the Sunday, and everyone had gone for Villa players, because they were like, oh, there's some actual players to play on Saturday, and the feeling of annoyance I got from that. And it wasn't. That's the funny thing. It wasn't even an early transfer. It was a couple of hours before deadline. That's pretty late. But that scarred me basically to the point where I was like, okay, from now on, I'm just going to make transfers like literally
That's a late
on the more.
That's a late transfer.
I know, but it's like I'm going to make transfers as late as possible. And funnily enough, I went back into my kind of out of character, I suppose, in midweek of game week 14, and I did early moves to get in Jackson, and obviously it backfired with Isak being fit. So that's not the sort of manager I like to be. But sometimes, if I get a feeling, if I get a player that's going up in price, I'll do it. But most of the time, as a rule, I like to make late as possible, which is scary, but it's also more exciting, I think.
Any other advice for being a good player? FPL player.
I kind of talked about it from a content creative. Get the noise out of your head, listen to your own thoughts. As a general FPL manager, the best advice I'd give to be a good FPL player is when you're doing well, it's very easy to think the game is easy. And when you're doing badly, it's very easy to think the opposite, right? And think this is the hardest game ever. What I will say is when you do well, don't take your foot off the pedal. Like it is what I would say, because it's so easy to like relax, and this is what casuals do, right? They look at the first few weeks and they're like, oh, I'm top of the league, it's fine, I'll breeze this mini league, and then by game week 30, when the double game weeks come in, the chips come in, that's when the strategy comes in, and that's when those that are engaged with the game really get an edge and move ahead. So to be an FPL manager, unfortunately, it's tiring, but you have to be on your finger on the pulse, and you have to not miss a kind of a detail, like a midweek deadline, like a kind of injury news update that have come in at morning.
You got to be consistent.
Yeah, you've got to be a consistent manager, and that's why it is hard, because for those that aren't willing to kind of stomach the amount of energy you have to put into the game to do well, it can just be a turn off. It can be just be like, you know what, I don't have the time for this. I've got a family to look after. I've got a job to do. But maybe for people like me,
the unimportant things. Think about your FPL team, sir.
Yeah, for people like me who's still not got a job and is not as busy as a lot of adults, I could probably get away with making FPL way too much of a thing in my life than it is. It should be probably, but for other people, yeah, definitely try and be consistent as you can, and just the more you play the game, the more opportunities you've got to do better. So if you've had a bad week, to be an FPL manager, just think to yourself, there's 38 times I'm going to play this season. It's not 1 week doesn't define me sort of thing. It's a lot of opportunities to get better as an FPL manager.
Awesome. Yeah, I've actually got a video coming out. It'll probably be the week after. This will be the last video on the channel for the year, basically talking about when I had it's a bit of just a New Year roundup, but basically talking about when I had a bad FPL Christmas, and two reasons I had a bad FPL Christmas. One being that I spent too much time on my team, and the other being that I didn't write reminders of the deadlines. And just sharing that experience so people can. I have a feeling that video might be hated, but just to tell the story a bit to. But it is really important to be consistent, I think.
100%. Yeah.
Roberto, mate, it has been amazing to have you on. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? Maybe you could just remind people again where they could find your podcast and stuff.
Oh, appreciate it. Firstly, I just want to say, Gary, it's been an absolute pleasure to come on. It's an honor to be allowed on, because I'm not like a massive content creator. I've said this, but to be even having this conversation to me is part of the fun. It's not about being on the channel. It's about breaking down FPL and in our minds and like our thought processes. And it's an absolute pleasure to be invited on. And honestly, the way I would describe this interview, and it's now coming to an end, it's like when kids are at like a playground or at the swings and their parents saying, we've got to come home now, we've got to leave the playground. I don't want to end this interview, honestly. It's been that entertaining and that therapeutic in a way to talk it all through. So thank you for content you do.
Thank you so much, mate. We're approaching Steve-O levels of length here. I think we're just going to be just under, so I'm going to have to think about. I'm not going to break this one into two parts, but yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Roberto. Please go and check out Roberto's
Yeah.
podcast. The form is
So yeah,
temporary.
you can follow us on Spotify. That's basically where we will post every week. So at the start of the season, we did a couple of on my FPL Yellow Army YouTube channel. We put a
I was
couple of
I
the
was
pods
actually going
up
to
on
ask. I
there.
forgot to ask that. Why did you stop putting it on YouTube?
Yeah, so the reason for that is literally time. So and it was also logistics of editing. So at the start of the season, obviously, I've got access to editing software back at uni that I don't have at home.
Okay.
So when at the start of the season I was at home and hadn't gone into uni till September, we were doing the pods literally only from home and via StreamYard and literally just uploading it from StreamYard straight onto Spotify and YouTube because we added it onto YouTube because it was the kind of pure content and it allowed you to see the raw sort of footage. Whereas I don't have the time when I'm at uni because of the kind of coursework and the kind of stuff in the week to do stuff on top of the audio. So that's why we tended to do that. So yeah, it was at the start of the season when I had a bit more time and I was around kind of house sort of time. But when I'm back at home and I have a bit more time, then we tend to sometimes put it on. But it's one of those things. We're mainly audio. That's where we get our joy from. But sometimes we like to, have those pod clips in the week and a bit of YouTube stuff.
And just show that it really is as there and not an impersonator.
Exactly. Yeah, it gives a bit of real character and feel to the pod when you see those video clips. Hopefully.
Yeah. Thank you again so much, Roberto, for coming on. Thank you to the viewers for listening. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and please subscribe to help me get other great FPL managers on, and to help me start the journey towards 300 subscribers. I guess now.
I have to mention one thing
before
I forget. FPL Juice's Nick. He mentioned this to me, and he said to mention it on the pod, so I will.
Okay.
There's this running gag that the first pod I went on Juice, the first time I went on as a guest, he did this funny quiz, right, where he made a list of loads of things, the most ridiculous.
Is this the thing about his nickname that he mentioned the other night? It's going to come.
Yeah. So he came up with like this really funny quiz. It was just more entertainment than anything of things that I'd done, and Ash had to try and work out if they were true or false. So he said stuff like, honestly, every time I watch back that video, it makes me cackle with laughter. It was stuff like, my favorite filling for a jacket potato is mashed potato. Stuff like that, where you think, it sounds so funny and so weird, and obviously it's not true.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. Exactly. That's the thing. So Nick was just coming up with these incredibly, stupidly incredible but ridiculous things that he was making up as if it was like, oh, this is a secret thing that Roberto does. And one of the things was, because I'm Portuguese, he thought, oh, let's try and work out like a Portuguese nickname. And so he typed into Google Translate, for some reason, I don't know why, the naked parrot. And so he said in the quiz question, true or false, is Roberto's nickname in Portuguese, it was something like El Papagaio Nui, which is the naked parrot, presumably in Portuguese. I don't know if it actually translates, but because of the fact we brought up this random stat, which of course is completely made up, now every single time I see him, he just mentions the naked parrot because of that. So yeah, maybe that should be the naked parrot FPL when FPL Yellow Army falls off a cliff. Who knows? But yeah, I just had to mention that.
Thank you for joining me, FPL Naked Parrot.
Oh no, I'm starting something now. What have I done?
Thank you to the viewers, and I will see you next time.